They told her she wasn't beautiful enough to be loved. 20 years of dust, disappointment, and a cracked mirror had convinced Hazel Wren they were right. But when a trail cowboy with sunlit eyes walked into her dying general store and looked at her like she was the only woman in the world, everything she believed about herself began to unravel. This is the story of a plain girl who discovered she was extraordinary all along. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The afternoon sun hammered down on Wild Rose Valley like God's own forge, turning the main street into a ribbon of shimmering heat that made the horizon dance and blur. Hazel Wren stood behind the counter of Wren's General Store, her hands planted on the scarred wood surface, watching dust motes spiral through the shaft of light that fell through the window. Her reflection wavered in the glass. Angular face, dark hair pulled back tight, skin tanned from necessity rather than leisure. She looked away quickly, the way she always did, focusing instead on the ledger spread before her with its brutal arithmetic of survival. 20 years old and she felt ancient. 20 years old and she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt young. The store smelled of old wood, kerosene, and the faint sweetness of the last barrel of molasses they'd probably never sell. Behind her, in the back room that served as both storage and living quarters, she could hear her father's labored breathing, the wet rattle that came after too many nights with a bottle. Samuel Wren had been a decent man once. Her mother had loved him, and Rebecca Wren hadn't been a woman who loved carelessly. But grief and whiskey had hollowed him out, left him a shell that Hazel had to keep alive with the same grim determination she brought to keeping the store's doors open. She dipped her pen in ink and returned to the numbers. They didn't lie, numbers. They didn't tell you that you were pretty when you weren't, didn't promise things they couldn't deliver. The columns told her what she already knew. They were 3 months behind on their account with the wholesaler in Blackwater. The roof needed patching before winter, and the money jar hidden beneath the floorboard in her room held exactly $17.32. Not enough for any of it. Beautiful day, ain't it, Hazel? She glanced up to see old Chester Malloy shuffling past the window, his hand raised in greeting. She lifted her own hand in response, managed a smile that felt like putting on a dress that no longer fit. Chester meant well. Everyone in Wild Rose Valley meant well. They meant well when they told her what a good daughter she was. They meant well when they mentioned how her mother would be proud. They meant well when they carefully avoided mentioning that at 20, most girls were married, or at least courted, and Hazel Wren was neither. The bell above the door chimed, a bright, cheerful sound that seemed to mock the weariness that had settled into Hazel's bones like dust. Margaret Sullivan swept in, all rustling skirts and rose water, her blonde hair perfect beneath her bonnet, her cheeks flushed with that particular glow of a woman who'd never gone hungry, never lain awake calculating whether to fix the roof or buy winter flour. Hazel, darling. Margaret's voice carried the crystalline, false warmth of women who called other women darling while cataloging their every flaw. How are you managing? I keep meaning to visit, but you know how busy things get. I'm well, Mrs. Sullivan. What can I get for you today? Hazel kept her voice level, professional, the same tone she'd use with any customer. Just some thread, the blue, if you have it, and perhaps some of that nice soap you keep behind the counter. Margaret leaned in conspiratorially, though there was no one else in the store to overhear. I wanted to tell you before you heard it from someone else. Matthew proposed last night. We'll be married in October. Matthew Sullivan, Margaret's distant cousin, visiting from Denver, a banker's son with soft hands and softer middle. Hazel had served him in the store twice. He'd looked through her both times, his gaze sliding past her like water off oiled leather. Congratulations, Hazel said, and meant it. She harbored no bitterness toward Margaret, no envy. Some women were born to silk dresses and wedding breakfasts. Some were born to calico and ledgers. I hope you'll be very happy. Oh, we will be. Matthew is so accomplished, so refined. He says Wild Rose Valley is quaint, but he thinks we should move to Denver after the wedding. Can you imagine? The theaters, the shops, the society. Margaret accepted the wrapped package Hazel handed her, placed her coins on the counter, exact change, always exact, as if overpaying by a penny might establish some obligation. You should think about coming to visit once we're settled. A change of scenery might do you good. Who knows? You might even meet someone. There are plenty of men in Denver who wouldn't mind a capable wife, even if she's not, well, you know, even if she's not pretty, even if she's not young anymore, even if she's used goods, shop-worn, marked down for quick sale. The words Margaret didn't say hung in the air like smoke. Hazel kept her expression neutral, practiced. That's kind of you to think of me. Safe travels, Mrs. Sullivan. After Margaret left, trailing rosewater and satisfaction, Hazel stood very still, listening to her father's breathing from the back room, the creak of the building settling, the distant sound of a dog barking. She looked down at her hands, calloused, capable, the nails trimmed short because there was no point in anything else. These were the hands that had bathed her mother's body when the fever finally took her. These were the hands that counted pills for her father, that lifted flour sacks and swept floors and wrote careful numbers in ledgers. These were not hands that would ever wear a wedding ring. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she'd made peace with the shape of her life 3 years ago, when her mother died and the full weight of survival had settled onto her shoulders. Romance was for other women, women like Margaret Sullivan with their perfect hair and their rose water and their soft, unmarked hands. Hazel's lot was duty, responsibility, the grim satisfaction of making it through another day. The thing was, most days she believed it. Most days the armor held, just not today. Not with Margaret's perfume still hanging in the air, not with the ledger showing numbers that wouldn't add up to salvation no matter how many times she recalculated them. Not with the late afternoon sun making her reflection in the window look even more severe, more plain, more utterly unremarkable than usual. Hazel closed the ledger with more force than necessary, walked to the window and pressed her forehead against the glass. The street outside shimmered with heat, empty except for a tumbleweed catching against the post office steps. Beyond the town, she could see the beginning of the open range, the endless prairie stretching toward mountains she'd never seen up close. Somewhere out there was the world Margaret would soon join, the world of theaters and society, of men who courted with flowers and pretty words, of women who were cherished rather than useful. I don't need it, she whispered to her wavering reflection. I have a life. I have purpose. I have... She stopped because even she couldn't finish the lie. The sound reached her before the sight did. The low thunder of hoofbeats, multiple horses moving at a steady lope. Hazel straightened, squinting against the glare. A group of riders emerged from the heat shimmer, maybe 10 or 12 men on horseback, trailing pack animals. Cowboys, from the look of them, probably an outfit moving cattle to the northern ranges. They'd pass through, maybe stop for supplies, and be gone by morning. Wild Rose Valley saw a lot of passing through. The riders slowed as they reached the edge of town, their horses' hooves changing rhythm from thunder to a more measured clip-clop on the hard-packed dirt. Hazel watched them with the detached interest of someone observing a parade that had nothing to do with her. Cowboys were all the same, loud, often drunk, usually crude. They'd buy tobacco and beans and whiskey, make jokes she was meant to ignore, and ride out without a backward glance. But then one of the riders at the front of the group turned his head toward the store, and even from this distance, even through the dusty window glass, Hazel felt something shift in the air around her. He was tall in the saddle, built lean rather than heavy, wearing the standard trail gear of dusty denim and faded shirt. His hat was pulled low against the sun, but she could see the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. And even though he was still 50 yards away, even though she'd never seen him before in her life, something about the way he sat his horse, the way he seemed to carry himself with a quiet grace that set him apart from the louder men around him, made her breath catch in her chest. He was looking at the store. No, he was looking at her. Through the window, across the distance, his gaze found hers and held it. Hazel stepped back from the glass as if burned, her heart suddenly hammering. Foolish. He was just another cowboy, looking at just another building. She was imagining things, projecting loneliness into a stranger's casual glance. She turned away from the window, busied herself with straightening cans that didn't need straightening, told herself to stop being ridiculous. The riders moved past, heading toward the livery stable. Their voices carried on the still air, rough laughter, someone calling out about getting drunk, another voice suggesting the boarding house for supper. The sounds faded as they moved down the street. Hazel released a breath she hadn't known she was holding and shook her head at her own foolishness. 20 years old and getting fluttery over a cowboy who'd probably glanced at the store window to check his own reflection. She returned to the counter, opened the ledger again, forced herself to focus on the numbers. The afternoon wore on toward evening, the light shifting from harsh white to honey gold. A few more customers trickled in, Mrs. Chen buying rice, young Tommy Preston sent by his mother for vinegar, old Doc Winters stocking up on bandages and muttering about how the heat made people crazy and careless. Hazel served them all with her usual efficiency, made change, offered polite conversation, and carefully did not think about riders or glances or the strange flutter that had briefly disturbed her carefully maintained composure. She was in the back room checking on her father, still sleeping, mercy on them both, when the bell chimed again. She wiped her hands on her apron and returned to the front, already forming the polite greeting she'd spoken 1,000 times. But the words died in her throat. The man from the street stood just inside the door, hat in his hands, the late afternoon light falling across his face. He was younger than she'd thought at first, maybe 23 or 24, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes that were an extraordinary shade of amber, like honey held up to sunlight. He had the lean, weathered look of someone who lived outdoors, worked hard, and ate sporadically. But there was something gentle in his expression, something courteous in the way he stood waiting for her to acknowledge him, that made him completely unlike every other trail cowboy she'd ever served. "Evening, miss," he said, and his voice was low, quiet, educated. "Hope I'm not too late for business." Hazel found her voice, though it came out slightly breathless. "No, not at all. We're open until 6. How can I help you?" He stepped farther into the store, moving with that same careful grace she'd noticed from the window. He didn't swagger or sprawl or take up more space than necessary. He looked around with genuine interest, taking in the shelves, the goods, the careful organization that Hazel had maintained through years of determined effort. "Nice store," he said simply. "You can tell someone cares about it." The compliment caught her off guard. People didn't usually notice things like that. "Thank you. It was my mother's. I do my best to keep it the way she did." His eyes returned to her face, and there was something in his gaze, not pity, not the casual assessment men usually gave women they found wanting, but something that looked almost like recognition, as if he saw something in her that she'd never seen in herself. "I'm sure she'd be proud," he said softly. Then, as if realizing he'd stepped over some invisible line of propriety, he cleared his throat and gestured toward the shelves. "I'm looking for writing paper. Good quality, if you have it. I need to write my sister. I've been on the trail for weeks, and I owe her a letter." "Of course." Hazel moved to the shelf where she kept paper goods, grateful for the excuse to turn away from that unnerving gaze. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled down a packet of good linen paper. "This is the best I have. It'll stand up to travel." "Perfect." He moved to the counter as she did, but made no move to crowd her, maintaining a respectful distance. When she placed the paper on the counter, he set his coins down gently beside it rather than tossing them across the wood the way most men did. His hands were calloused, scarred across the knuckles, but his fingers were long and careful as he counted out the exact price. "You're with the outfit that came through earlier?" Hazel asked, then immediately regretted it. She didn't make small talk with customers. Small talk led to familiarity, and familiarity with men like this, handsome, transient, kind, led nowhere good. But he nodded, seeming pleased that she'd asked. "Yes, ma'am. Turner Outfit, heading north to the high country. We'll be here tonight and gone by morning." He paused, then added, almost shyly, "My name's Cade. Cade Turner." Hazel Wren. The words were out before she could stop them, a breach of her usual professional distance. "Hazel," he repeated, and the way he said her name, carefully, as if it meant something, made that flutter return to her chest. "That's a beautiful name. Suits you." She nearly laughed at the absurdity of it, this handsome stranger calling her beautiful, even indirectly, but there was no mockery in his expression, no sly edge to his words. He looked like he meant it, impossible as that was. "Is there anything else you need, Mr. Turner?" She heard the slight frost in her own voice, the defensive walls going up. Beautiful girls got compliments, plain girls got mocked or pitied, and she didn't know which would be worse. "Cade," he corrected gently. "Just Cade." He picked up his package but made no move toward the door. Instead, he seemed to be gathering courage for something, his jaw working slightly, his fingers tightening on his hat. Finally, the words came out in a rush. "Would it be forward to ask if you might join me for supper?" The world tilted slightly. Hazel stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry?" "Supper," he repeated, his cheeks coloring slightly. "At the boarding house. Mrs. Fletcher's supposed to be serving pot roast tonight, and I'd be honored if you'd join me, if that wouldn't be inappropriate." 1,000 responses crowded into Hazel's throat. Yes. No. Why? "You don't mean it. This is a joke. I'm not the kind of woman men invite to supper." But what came out was a barely audible, "I don't understand." Cade's expression softened into something that looked like understanding, maybe even sympathy, though not the pitying kind. "I know I'm a stranger. I know this is sudden. But from the moment I saw you in the window, He trailed off, seemed to search for words, then tried again. "You're going to think I'm crazy, but I felt like I knew you, like I'd been looking for you without knowing it. And I leave tomorrow, and I'll regret it the rest of my life if I don't at least ask." He paused. "Please, just supper. No expectations, no obligations. Just two people sharing a meal and conversation." Hazel's mind raced. This was madness. Cowboys didn't ask plain shopgirls to supper. Handsome men with gentle eyes and educated voices didn't look at women like her and feel anything resembling recognition. This was a trick, or a bet, or some cruel game his friends had put him up to. But looking into his eyes, she couldn't find any trace of deception. Just hope. Just nervous, genuine hope. She faltered. "I need to tend to my father. He's not well, and I can't leave him alone for long." "I understand." Cade's disappointment was visible but gracious. "Of course. Family comes first." He moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "If you change your mind, I'll be at the boarding house at 7. I'll wait until past, just in case. And if you don't come, I'll understand that too. But I hope you will, Hazel Wren. I really do." Then he was gone, the bell chiming cheerfully in his wake, leaving Hazel standing behind the counter with her heart hammering and her carefully constructed certainties crumbling around her. She closed the store in a daze, checking the locks twice, counting the register 3 times before getting the numbers right. In the back room, her father was awake, sitting on the edge of his cot, staring at nothing with the vacant expression that meant he'd been into the bottle she knew he kept hidden beneath the loose floorboard. "There's stew from yesterday," she said, ladling it into a bowl. "You need to eat, Papa." Samuel Wren took the bowl with shaking hands. "Your mother used to make stew," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Not as good as hers. Nothing's as good as it was." "I know, Papa." She'd had this conversation 100 times. She sat beside him, watched him eat, counted his breaths, checked his color. He was getting worse. They both knew it, neither spoke of it. When he finished, she helped him back to lying down, pulled the thin blanket over him, and stood in the doorway watching until his breathing evened into sleep. Then she climbed the narrow stairs to her own room, barely more than a closet with a window, and sat on her bed in the gathering dusk. Through the window, she could see the lights coming on in the buildings along Main Street. The boarding house was 3 blocks north. 7 o'clock. He'd said 7 o'clock. Hazel looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror that hung above her washstand. Same face she saw every morning, same angular features, same too wide mouth, same eyes that were an indeterminate shade between gray and green. Same dark hair that never did what she wanted, currently pulled back in a bun so tight it gave her a headache. "He's being kind," she told her reflection. "Cowboys are always kind when they want something. Tomorrow he'll be gone and you'll be right back here, and this will be a story you'll turn over in your mind until it becomes ridiculous." But what if it wasn't ridiculous? What if, just once, she let herself believe that someone might see something in her worth knowing? The thought was dangerous. Dangerous as a match in dry grass, as stepping off a cliff, as hoping for anything beyond the narrow corridor of survival she'd learned to navigate. Margaret Sullivan got supper invitations and marriage proposals. Hazel Wren got duty and endurance and the cold comfort of making it through another day. Except Cade Turner had looked at her like she was Margaret Sullivan. Like she was more than Margaret Sullivan. Like she was someone worth waiting for. Hazel stood abruptly and went to her wardrobe. Calling it that was generous. It was really just a series of hooks on the wall. She owned 4 dresses, the faded calico she wore every day, 2 others nearly identical, and 1 green skirt with a white blouse that her mother had made her 3 years ago for occasions that never came. She pulled the green skirt out, held it against herself, tried to remember the last time she'd worn something that wasn't work-stained and worn thin. "This is foolish," she said aloud. "You're being foolish." But she was already washing her face, already taking down her hair and brushing it until it fell in dark waves past her shoulders. She changed into the green skirt and white blouse, stood before the mirror, and barely recognized herself. Without the armor of her work dress and severe hairstyle, she looked younger, softer. No. She stopped that thought before it could complete. She wasn't beautiful. Wishing couldn't make it so. But maybe, just for tonight, she could be pretty enough. Maybe, just for one evening, she could pretend to be the kind of woman who got invited to supper. She found the sprig of wildflowers she'd picked that morning, a habit from her mother, who always kept fresh flowers in the store, and tucked it into her hair. It was a small thing, probably ridiculous, but it made her feel like she was trying, like she was someone who deserved to try. The boarding house clock read 7:10 when Hazel slipped out the back door of the store. Having left a note for her father, she prayed he'd see if he woke. The evening air was cooling rapidly, the way it did in the valley, the sky above fading from blue to purple. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain everyone on Main Street could hear it. Twice she almost turned back. Twice she forced herself forward. The boarding house sat on the corner of Main and 3rd, a sprawling 2-story structure with a wide porch where Mrs. Fletcher's boarders gathered on summer evenings. Tonight, several cowboys from Cade's outfit lounged on the steps, smoking and talking in low voices. They looked up as Hazel approached, their conversation dying. She felt their eyes on her, assessing, surprised, curious. She held her head high and climbed the steps, her legs shaking beneath her skirt. "Help you, miss?" One of them, a heavy-set man with graying temples, tipped his hat. "I'm meeting someone," Hazel said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "Cade's inside," another man said with a knowing grin. "Lucky bastard." She pushed through the door before she could lose her courage. The boarding house dining room was crowded with boarders and guests, the air thick with the smell of pot roast and fresh bread. Mrs. Fletcher herself was moving between tables, laughing at something a guest had said. And there, at a small table near the window, sitting alone with his back straight and his hands folded in front of him, was Cade Turner. He saw her the moment she entered. His whole face transformed, surprise melting into something that looked almost like wonder. He stood so quickly, his chair scraped loudly against the floor, and suddenly the entire room was looking at them. Hazel felt her cheeks flame, but she forced herself to cross the room, to walk toward him, as if she did this sort of thing every day. "You came," Cade said when she reached the table, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I wasn't sure. I hoped, but I wasn't sure." "I almost didn't," Hazel admitted, standing beside the empty chair. He moved quickly to pull it out for her, his manners impeccable. As she sat, she heard the whispers starting around the room. Mrs. Fletcher's guests noting this development, probably already weaving stories about the plain shop girl and the handsome cowboy. Let them talk. For once, Hazel didn't care. "You look—" Cade stopped, seemed to search for adequate words. "When you walked in, it was like the whole room changed color, like someone lit a lamp in a dark place." Hazel felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "You don't have to say things like that." "I know I don't have to." He sat down across from her, leaned forward earnestly. "I'm saying them because they're true. Because I've been sitting here for the last 20 minutes trying to figure out how to tell you what I saw when you walked through that door, and those are the only words I can find that come close." Mrs. Fletcher appeared at their table, her eyebrows raised in interested surprise. "Well, Hazel Wren, aren't you looking lovely tonight? What can I get you to?" They ordered pot roast for both, coffee, pie for dessert, and then they were alone in the crowded room, and Hazel didn't know what to say. Every social grace her mother had tried to teach her fled in the face of Cade's steady, warm gaze. "Tell me about yourself," he said gently. "Tell me everything." So she did. Slowly at first, then with growing ease, She told him about her mother, about the store, about her father's grief and how it had swallowed him whole. She told him about the ledgers that never quite balanced, about Margaret Sullivan and her banker's son, about the cracked mirror and the conviction that had settled into her bones that some lives were small lives and hers was one of them. And Cade listened, really listened, the way she imagined people in novels listen to each other, leaning forward, asking questions, his eyes never leaving her face. He didn't try to fix anything or offer empty platitudes. He just listened, and somehow that was more precious than any compliment. Then it was his turn. He told her about growing up on a struggling ranch in Oklahoma, about losing his mother when he was 15, about his sister Emily who was studying to be a teacher in St. Louis. He talked about the trail life, the loneliness of it, the beauty of it, the way it made you feel both infinite and insignificant. He described sunrises over mountains she'd never see, rivers that ran so clear you could count stones on the bottom, storms that lit up the sky like God's own artillery. Then why do it? Hazel asked. If you could have stability, a real home, why choose the trail? Cade was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the worn tablecloth. I guess I've been looking for something. I didn't know what until... He looked up at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Until I walked into that store this afternoon. The room seemed to shrink until there was nothing but the two of them, this small table, this moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. Hazel wanted to say something clever, something that would deflect the weight of what he was implying, but she couldn't. She could only sit there, caught in his gaze, feeling something long dormant stirring in her chest. I leave tomorrow, Cade said quietly. That's the reality. We ride north at first light. But Hazel... He reached across the table, stopped just short of touching her hand, asking permission with his eyes. When she didn't pull away, he covered her fingers with his own. I don't want to leave without knowing if I'll see you again. I live here, Hazel said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll always be here. I can't leave my father, can't leave the store, this is my life. Then I'll come back. The certainty in his voice was almost frightening. We'll be in the high country for about 6 weeks, then we head back south. I can stop here. I can... He paused, seemed to realize how forward he was being, how presumptuous. If you want me to. If this isn't just a nice evening for you. If it feels like it does to me. Hazel looked at their joined hands on the table, at the contrast between his sun-darkened skin and her own paler fingers. This was madness. This was the kind of thing that happened in the dime novels she secretly read when the store was quiet, not in real life, not to girls like her. But God help her, she wanted it, wanted to believe it, wanted to hope that maybe, just maybe, her life could be more than surviving. It feels like that to me too, she whispered. It shouldn't, but it does. Cade's grip on her hand tightened and his smile was like sunrise. Then I'll come back, I swear it. I'll come back for you, Hazel Wren. They stayed at the boarding house until Mrs. Fletcher started giving them pointed looks and clearing nearby tables with unnecessarily loud clattering. Outside, the night had fully settled, the sky brilliant with stars that seemed close enough to touch. The streets were quiet except for distant laughter from the saloon 2 blocks over and the occasional bark of a dog. Cade insisted on walking her home, and Hazel didn't protest. They walked slowly, neither wanting the evening to end, their shoulders nearly touching, the warm night air wrapped around them like a cocoon. When they reached the store, Hazel stopped at the bottom of the outside stairs that led to the living quarters, suddenly uncertain. Thank you, she said. For supper. For listening. For all of it. Thank you for coming. For giving me a chance. Cade stood facing her, his hat in his hands again, his face soft in the starlight. Hazel, I know this is fast. I know I'm just some cowboy passing through, but I need you to know this meant something to me. You mean something to me. She couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. Instead, she reached up and touched his face, just briefly, her fingertips grazing his cheek. He caught her hand, held it against his face for a moment, his eyes closing. All right, he promised, and I'll be back before you know it. 6 weeks, maybe 7. Will you wait? Yes, she said, the word escaping before her practical mind could cage it. Yes, I'll wait. He kissed her hand then, formal and old-fashioned and absolutely devastating, before releasing her and stepping back. "Good night, Hazel Wren. Dream of me, if you can." She watched him walk back toward the boarding house, his figure gradually swallowed by the darkness. Only when he'd completely disappeared did she climb the stairs to her room, where she sat on her bed in the dark and pressed her hand, the one he'd kissed, against her heart, and wondered if it was possible to fall in love in the space of a single evening. She fell asleep still wearing the green skirt, still feeling the ghost of his lips on her hand, and for the first time in 3 years, Hazel Wren went to sleep smiling. Dawn came too early and too bright, spilling through Hazel's window like an accusation. She woke with her face pressed against the pillow, still wearing the green skirt, the wildflower crushed and wilted in her hair. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember why her heart felt so full, why there was this strange lightness in her chest that felt like hope or terror, or both at once. Then memory crashed back. Cade's amber eyes, his hand covering hers, the promise hanging between them like a bridge across an impossible distance. 6 weeks. Maybe 7. He'd said he'd come back. She rose quickly, splashed water on her face from the basin, changed into her work calico with fumbling fingers. The wildflower fell to the floor and she picked it up, smoothed its petals carefully, then pressed it between the pages of her mother's Bible on the nightstand. A keepsake. A reminder that last night had actually happened, that it hadn't been some fever dream born of loneliness and ledgers that wouldn't balance. Downstairs, her father was already awake, sitting at the small table in the back room with his head in his hands. The bottle beside him was empty. Hazel's brief surge of happiness deflated like a punctured bladder. "Papa?" She kept her voice gentle, though frustration scraped at her throat. "You promised you'd try." "Did I?" Samuel Wren looked up at her with bloodshot eyes. "Can't remember much these days, Hazel girl. Can't remember much except that your mother's gone and nothing's right anymore." She wanted to scream at him, wanted to shake him and tell him that she was still here, that she'd sacrificed every dream she'd ever had to keep him alive and the store afloat, that his grief was eating both of them alive. But she'd learned years ago that screaming at grief was like screaming at the wind, pointless and exhausting. Instead, she made coffee, fried eggs and salt pork, set the plate in front of him with more force than necessary. "Eat. I need to open the store." Through the back window, she could see the street beginning to wake. The Turner outfit would be gathering their horses, checking their gear, preparing to ride north toward whatever work waited in the high country. Cade would be among them. The thought made her stomach twist with something she couldn't name. She opened the store at 6, same as always, sweeping the front step, arranging the display in the window, checking the register. Everything normal, everything the same as it had been yesterday morning, except she wasn't the same. Something had shifted inside her, like a door opening onto a room she hadn't known existed. The first customers were the usual early risers, Mrs. Chen buying coffee, old Chester Malloy needing tobacco, young Billy Morrison sent by his mother for baking soda. Hazel served them with her customary efficiency, made change, smiled at the appropriate moments. But part of her attention stayed fixed on the window, on the street outside, where any moment now a group of riders would appear. It was nearly 7 when they came. She heard them before she saw them, the jingle of tack, the low voices of men checking stirrups and securing bedrolls. Her hands stilled on the jar of penny candy she'd been restocking. Through the window, she watched the outfit assemble, horses dancing in the cool morning air, breath steaming from both animal and human mouths. And there was Cade, mounted on a rangy bay gelding, adjusting his hat against the rising sun. Even from this distance, even among a dozen other men, she could pick him out instantly. It was like her eyes had been trained overnight to find him in any crowd, to track the particular way he moved, the line of his shoulders. As if he felt her watching, he turned toward the store. Their eyes met across the distance, and even through dusty glass and morning glare, she felt the connection like a physical thing. He touched his hat brim, a small gesture, private, meant only for her. She lifted her hand in response, pressed her palm flat against the window. Then the outfit's trail boss called something, the men began to move, and Cade had to turn his attention back to his horse. The group fell into formation, a loose column of riders heading north up Main Street. Hazel watched them go, watched Cade's straight back recede into the distance. watched until the last rider disappeared around the bend past the livery stable, and all that remained was settling dust in the memory of amber eyes promising to return. She stood at the window for a long time after they'd gone, her hand still pressed to the glass, telling herself she wasn't going to cry. Crying was foolish. This was what trail cowboys did. They passed through, they made promises easy as breathing, and they rode away. 6 weeks meant nothing. 7 weeks meant nothing. Men like Cade Turner forgot girls like Hazel Wren before the sun reached its zenith. "Stop it," she whispered to herself fiercely. "Just stop." The bell chimed and Margaret Sullivan swept in, all morning freshness and barely contained excitement. "Hazel, I heard the most interesting gossip this morning. Mrs. Fletcher told my mother that you were at the boarding house last night having supper with one of those cowboys. Is it true?" Hazel forced herself to turn from the window, to face Margaret's avid curiosity with something resembling composure. "I had supper." "Yes. But why? I mean—" Margaret caught herself, but not before Hazel saw the genuine confusion in her face. "Why would a handsome cowboy invite you? Why would you think you belonged there?" "I mean, wasn't that rather forward? You don't even know him." "Oh," he asked politely. "I accepted." Hazel moved behind the counter, kneading the barrier between them. "Was there something you needed this morning, Mrs. Sullivan?" "Oh, just some thread, the white this time. And I wanted to tell you that Matthew and I have set the wedding date for October 15th. We're sending invitations next week." Margaret leaned across the counter conspiratorially. "But seriously, Hazel, you should be careful. Those trail cowboys, they're not the marrying kind. They say pretty things and then they disappear. I'd hate to see you get hurt." The words stung because they echoed Hazel's own fears so precisely, but she kept her face neutral as she wrapped the thread. "I appreciate your concern. That'll be 15 cents. After Margaret left, trailing warnings and false sympathy, Hazel allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of standing very still behind the counter, breathing carefully, reminding herself that hope was dangerous and expecting nothing meant never being disappointed. Then she straightened her shoulders, opened the ledger, and returned to the arithmetic of survival. The days that followed developed a strange quality, as if she were living in two worlds simultaneously. There was the real world, the store that needed running, the father who needed tending, the bills that needed paying, the roof that needed patching before winter. And then there was the other world, the one that existed in the quiet spaces between customers, the world where she replayed every moment of that evening, every word Cade had spoken, every look he'd given her. 3 days after he left, she found herself standing in front of her small mirror in the evening, studying her reflection with new eyes. What had he seen? What had made him look at her that way, like she was something precious? She turned her head, trying to find the angle that might explain it, but she saw only what she'd always seen: 2 sharp cheekbones, eyes that couldn't decide their color, mouth too wide for true beauty. "You're being ridiculous," she told her reflection. He was just being kind. But she couldn't quite make herself believe it, not when she remembered the way his voice had roughened when he'd said her name, not when she could still feel the ghost of his kiss on her hand. A week passed, then 2. Life went on with its usual rhythms, but Hazel found herself humming while she swept, catching herself smiling for no reason while she stocked shelves. Her father noticed, emerged briefly from his fog of grief and whiskey, to peer at her with something like curiosity. "You're different," Samuel said one evening, his words only slightly slurred. "There's a light in you. Haven't seen that since before your mother." He stopped, unable to finish. "I'm fine, Papa, just fine." But she squeezed his shoulder as she passed, grateful for the brief moment of his attention. Mrs. Chen noticed too. "You look happy, Hazel girl. Something good happen?" "Just a nice evening," Hazel said carefully. "Nothing more." But there was more. There was the way her heart jumped every time the bell chimed, hoping impossibly that it might be a letter, that he might have found a way to send word. There was the way she caught herself touching her hand to her cheek, in the same place he'd touched it, as if the memory had left a physical mark. There was the way sunset took on new meaning because it meant another day closer to 6 weeks, to 7, to the possibility of seeing him again. It was Doc Winters who brought the first real news, 3 weeks after Cade had left. The old physician came in for his weekly supply of bandages and liniment, his face grave. Heard about some trouble up north, he said, counting out coins. Newman Ranch, up in the high country. Some dispute between the outfit working there and another group. Shots fired. Men hurt, maybe killed. Hazel's hands froze on the register keys. What outfit? Didn't catch the name, just heard it from a freight hauler passing through. Could be rumors, could be truth. Hard to say. Doc Winters peered at her over his spectacles. You all right, Hazel? You've gone pale. Fine, I'm fine. But her voice came from very far away. After Doc left, she stood behind the counter trying to breathe normally, trying not to let her mind spiral into terrible possibilities. Newman Ranch. Kate had said they were heading to the high country. But the high country was vast, hundreds of miles of open range and isolated ranches. It might not be his outfit. It probably wasn't. Trouble like that happened all the time in cattle country. Disputes over water rights, grazing land, accusations of rustling. But what if it was? The thought followed her through the rest of the day, through serving customers and balancing the register and making supper for her father. That night she lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining all the ways a man could be hurt or killed on the trail, trampled by cattle, thrown from a horse, shot in some stupid argument over nothing. The frontier was littered with graves of young men who'd thought they were invincible. She got up, lit her lamp, and pulled out the sheet of writing paper she'd purchased from her own stock. She'd never written a letter to a man before, had no idea where to even send it, but she needed to do something with the fear churning in her chest. So she wrote, Dear Cade, I hope this letter finds you well and safe. I heard about trouble at Newman Ranch, and I'm worried, though I'm probably being foolish. You've likely forgotten all about the plain shop girl in Wild Rose Valley by now. But I wanted you to know that I think of you, that I'm keeping count of the weeks, that I meant what I said about waiting. Please be careful. Please come back. Yours, Hazel. She folded it carefully, sealed it with wax, and wrote Cade Turner on the outside, even though she had no address to add. Then she tucked it in her Bible beside the pressed wildflower, a letter that would never be sent, but that somehow made her feel less helpless. The fourth week brought the first real test of her hope. A different outfit came through town, heading south from the high country. Hazel positioned herself at the window as they passed, searching each face for amber eyes and a gentle smile. When she didn't find him, she told herself it meant nothing. Different outfit, different route. But disappointment settled in her stomach like a stone. One of the cowboys from the southern outfit came into the store, and Hazel found herself asking before she could stop herself, Did you happen to pass a Turner outfit up north? The cowboy, a grizzled man with a scar across his cheek, scratched his beard. Turner? Yeah, I know the outfit. They were at Newman Ranch last I heard. There was some trouble there a couple weeks back, shooting over disputed grazing rights. Don't know if the Turner boys were involved or not. Why? You know someone with them? Just curious, Hazel managed, though her hands shook as she made change. That night she couldn't eat. Her father commented on it, brief flicker of paternal concern breaking through his usual stupor. You're looking thin, girl. Not sleeping neither. What's eating at you? Nothing, Papa, just tired. But it wasn't nothing. It was the slow erosion of hope, the practical voice in her head growing louder, reminding her that cowboys made promises they didn't keep, that 6 weeks was an eternity for a man on the trail, that she'd been a fool to believe even for a moment that someone like Cade Turner would actually come back for someone like her. 5 weeks. The store's roof sprang a leak during a rare summer storm, and Hazel spent hours in the attic with a bucket and tar, trying to patch it herself because there was no money to hire help. She came down covered in black tar and cobwebs, exhausted and close to tears, and found her father passed out on the floor of the back room, the latest bottle shattered beside him. She cleaned up the glass, got him onto his cot, and sat beside him in the dark, listening to his labored breathing and wondering how much longer she could do this alone. That's when she heard it, the sound of someone knocking at the back door, even though the store was long closed. Her first thought was Cade, that he'd come back early, and her heart leaped so hard it hurt. She scrambled to her feet, yanked open the door. It was Chester Malloy, his old face concerned in the lamplight. Sorry to disturb you so late, Hazel, but I saw your lamp was still on, and I wanted to tell you there's going to be a dance at the church social hall next Saturday. The whole town will be there. You should come. Do you good to get out, have some fun. You work too hard." The disappointment was crushing. She managed to smile. "Thank you, Chester. I'll think about it." But she wouldn't go. She couldn't imagine going to a dance, watching couples whirl across the floor, pretending she didn't spend every spare moment waiting for someone who was probably never coming back. 6 weeks came and went. Hazel marked it in the ledger with a small notation: July 1st, the day Cade had promised to return. She opened the store at the usual time, served the usual customers, kept herself busy with inventory and cleaning. She didn't stand at the window watching the road. She didn't let herself hope. But when the day ended with no sign of him, no letter, no word, something inside her cracked. That evening, she took the ring box from beneath her floorboard. She'd been saving for the roof, for her father's medicine, for all the practical necessities that filled her days. She counted the money slowly. $23 now. Not enough. Never enough. And suddenly the futility of it all crashed over her. What was she doing? Why was she killing herself to maintain this half-life, caring for a father who wanted to die, running a store that barely survived, waiting for a man who'd forgotten she existed? She walked to her room, pulled out the unsent letter and the pressed wildflower, and sat on her bed staring at them. Evidence of her foolishness. Proof that she'd let herself believe in something that was never real. The tears came then, hot and angry and despairing. She cried for her mother who'd died too young, for her father who died inside even though his body kept breathing, for her own loneliness, for the green skirt that hung unworn in her wardrobe, for the girl she might have been if life had dealt her different cards. And she cried for Cade Turner, for the promise he hadn't kept, for the way he'd made her believe, just for one evening, one perfect evening, that she might be someone worth coming back for. When the tears finally stopped, she felt hollow but strangely calm. She put the letter and the wildflower back in the Bible, closed it firmly, and made a decision. No more waiting, no more hoping. Tomorrow she would wake up and be practical Hazel again, the girl who survived, who endured, who asked for nothing because nothing was all she'd ever get. But tomorrow came with its own surprise. She was opening the store, still moving through the fog of her resolved despair, when she heard horses. Just a few riders, not a whole outfit. She didn't look up, wouldn't let herself look up. The bell chimed. "Morning, miss. You got any of that good writing paper left?" The voice froze her in place. She knew that voice, had replayed it in her mind 1,000 times. Slowly, not trusting her ears, she turned around. Cade Turner stood just inside the door, hat in hands, looking travel-worn and exhausted and more wonderful than her memory had captured. He was thinner. There was a healing cut above his left eyebrow, and he swayed slightly as if he'd ridden too long without rest. But his eyes, those amber eyes that had haunted her dreams, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "You came back," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I told you I would." His voice was rough, raw with emotion. "I told you I would, Hazel." She couldn't move, couldn't speak. This wasn't happening. She'd cried herself empty last night, had made peace with loss. She couldn't let hope back in. It would destroy her. Cade took a step forward, then another, until he stood on his side of the counter and she stood on hers, with only a few feet of space and a chasm of fear between them. "I'm late," he said. "I know I'm late. There was trouble at Newman Ranch, just like you probably heard. Shooting. Men hurt. It took longer than expected, and then, when we finally got clear, I rode straight through to get here. Didn't stop except to rest the horse. I couldn't—" His voice broke. "I couldn't stand the thought that you might think I'd forgotten, that you might think I didn't care." "It's July 4th, Hazel said numbly. "You said July 1st. "I know, God, I know. I'm so sorry." He set his hat on the counter, ran his hands through his hair in agitation. "Say something, please. Tell me I'm not too late. Tell me you haven't—" "I thought you were dead," she interrupted, and suddenly she was shaking, all the fear and grief and anger of the past weeks flooding through her. "I heard about the shooting, and I thought, I waited every day, watching the road like a fool, and you didn't come. July 1st came and went, and you didn't come, and I thought—" She couldn't finish. The tears were back, furious tears, and she hated them, hated crying in front of him, hated the weakness that made her care so much about a man she barely knew. Cade moved around the counter in 2 quick strides and pulled her into his arms. She should have pushed him away, should have maintained her dignity, but instead she found herself clinging to him, her face pressed against his chest, his heart hammering beneath her ear. "I'm here," he said into her hair, his voice shaking. "I'm here, Hazel. I'm alive and I'm here, and I'm so damn sorry I scared you. But I'm here now. I came back for you just like I promised." She pulled back enough to look up at him, needing to see his face, needing to read the truth there. "Why? Why would you come back for me? I'm nobody. I'm just—" He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Don't," he said fiercely. "Don't ever say that again. You're everything, Hazel. Every night on the trail, every morning waking up under the stars, all I could think about was getting back here, getting back to you. You became my compass, my true north. You barely know me. I know enough." His eyes searched hers with desperate intensity. "I know you're brave. I know you carry the weight of this whole store, of your father, of everything on your shoulders, and you never complain. I know you pressed a wildflower in your hair for our supper, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I know that when I'm with you, I feel like I've finally found the place I'm supposed to be." Hazel wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly it physically hurt. But the voice of doubt, honed by 20 years of being overlooked, of being the plain one, the useful one, the one who was never chosen, whispered its poison. "Men like you don't fall in love with girls like me. It's some kind of mistake. You'll realize it and—" "Stop." Cade's voice was gentle but firm. He pulled something from his pocket, a small cloth bundle, and pressed it into her hand. "Open it." With shaking fingers, she unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a ring, delicate, old, a pearl set in worn gold. It glowed in the morning light filtering through the store window. "It was my mother's," Cade said quietly. "The only thing I have of hers. I've been carrying it since I was 15, waiting for the right person, for the woman I'd want to spend my life with." He took the ring from her trembling hand and held it up. "I want that woman to be you, Hazel Wren. I know it's fast, I know it's crazy, but I also know what I feel, and I know I've never felt it before, and I know I won't feel it again. So I'm asking, not proposing, not yet, that wouldn't be fair when I'm about to leave again, but I'm asking if you'll wear this ring while I'm gone, as a promise, as proof that I'm coming back, that I mean every word I've said." The store seemed to spin around her. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to women like her. But the ring was real. She could feel its weight, see the way the pearl caught the light. And Cade was real, standing before her with his heart in his eyes, offering her something she'd never dared to want. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "It's too much. If something happened to you, then you'd have something to remember me by." His voice was steady now, certain, but nothing's going to happen. "I'm going to finish this season, save every penny, and come back in the fall. And then, if you'll have me, if you haven't changed your mind, I'm going to ask you properly. I'm going to marry you, Hazel. We're going to run this store together, take care of your father together, build a life together." "You don't want a life here," she protested weakly. "You're a trail cowboy. You want the open range, the freedom—" "I want you." The simplicity of it silenced her. "I thought I wanted the trail, the wandering, but what I really wanted was a home. And home isn't a place, Hazel. It's you." She looked down at the ring in his hand, then up at his face, at the healing cut, the exhaustion, the absolute determination in his eyes. He'd ridden straight through to get here, had pushed himself and his horse to the limit because he couldn't bear the thought of her doubting him. Maybe, just maybe, this was real. "All right," she said, the words barely audible. "All right, I'll wear it." The smile that broke across Cade's face was like sunrise. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was slightly loose, would need resizing, but it fit well enough. Then he raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, just like he had that first night, and Hazel felt something inside her chest crack open, something she'd kept locked and protected for so long she'd forgotten it was there. "I have to leave again tomorrow," Cade said, still holding her hand. "We're heading east this time, different contract. But I'll be back by October, late October at the latest. And this time I'll write. I'll send letters to the general store in every town we pass through. You'll be so sick of hearing from me, you'll be ready to give the ring back." Hazel laughed, a sound that felt rusty from disuse. I won't give it back. Promise? Promise. They stood there in the morning light, hands clasped, the ring warm on her finger, and for the first time in years, Hazel allowed herself to hope. Really hope. Not the desperate, fearful hoping of the past weeks, but the kind of hope that felt like solid ground beneath her feet. The bell chimed as the door opened, and they sprang apart like guilty children. Mrs. Chen entered, stopped short when she saw them, her eyes widening as she took in Hazel's tear-stained face, Cade's possessive stance, the ring glinting on Hazel's finger. "Oh my," Mrs. Chen said, a smile spreading across her face. "Oh my goodness, Hazel dear, are you—" "Mrs. Chen, this is Cade Turner," Hazel said, and her voice was steadier now, stronger. We're—" She looked at Cade helplessly. "I'm courting her," Cade said firmly, sliding an arm around Hazel's waist. "With intentions to marry, if she'll have me." Mrs. Chen's smile grew impossibly wider. "Well, I'll be. Hazel Wren, you dark horse. Wait until I tell Mr. Chen. Wait until I tell everyone. The whole town will be so happy for you, dear," after Mrs. Chen left, probably already composing the gossip she'd share at every stop on her morning rounds. Cade and Hazel looked at each other and burst out laughing. The secret was out. By noon, all of Wild Rose Valley would know that plain Hazel Wren had somehow captured the heart of a handsome cowboy. The whispers would start, the speculation, the doubt. Margaret Sullivan would probably have a dozen theories about what Cade really wanted. Let them talk. For once, Hazel didn't care. She spent the rest of that day in a daze. Cade stayed as long as he could, helping her stock shelves, carrying heavy boxes, charming every customer who came through the door. He met her father, who emerged from his fog long enough to shake Cade's hand and mumble something about Rebecca would have liked him. And when evening came and the store finally closed, they sat on the steps out back, watching the sun set over the valley, Hazel's hand in his, the ring catching the last golden light. "I don't want you to go," Hazel admitted quietly. "I know. I don't want to go either." Cade squeezed her hand. "But this is the last season. I'm going to save every penny I earn. And when I come back, I'm done with the trail life. Done with wandering. I'm coming home to you for good." "Home," Hazel repeated, testing the word. It had always meant burden, responsibility, survival. But the way Cade said it, it sounded like promise, like beginning, like something worth building. They sat in silence for a while, not needing words, just the warmth of each other's presence and the deepening twilight. Finally, Cade stood, pulled her to her feet, and held her close. "Thank you," he said into her hair. "For what?" "For waiting. For hoping. For giving me something worth coming back to." He pulled back, looked into her eyes. "I love you, Hazel Wren. I know it's too soon to say it. I know we've only spent a handful of hours together, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you." The tears came again, but they were different this time. Not grief or fear, but overwhelming emotion, the feeling of being seen, being chosen, being loved. "I love you too," she whispered. "God help me, I do." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and careful, like she was something precious that might break. And when he finally pulled away, they were both trembling. "October," he said firmly. "Late October. I'll come back for you, and we'll figure out the rest together, all right?" "All right." She watched him ride away at dawn the next morning, the ring heavy on her finger, her heart somehow both breaking and soaring. The store needed opening, the ledgers needed updating, her father needed tending, but for once the weight of it all felt different, lighter, because she wasn't carrying it alone anymore, because someone had looked at her and seen not a burden but a treasure, because Cade Turner loved her, and this time she believed it. The days after Cade's departure should have been unbearable, but they weren't. They were different in a way Hazel couldn't quite articulate. The same tasks, the same routines, but shot through with light. She caught herself humming while she swept the floor, smiling at customers for no reason, touching the ring on her finger like a talisman. Mrs. Chen had been true to her word. By the end of that first day, the entire town knew about Hazel Wren and her cowboy, and the reactions ranged from genuine happiness to barely concealed skepticism. Margaret Sullivan came in on the third day, her face a study in confused disbelief. She circled the counter like a cat stalking prey, her eyes fixed on the pearl ring that Hazel no longer bothered to hide. "So it's true then," Margaret said finally. "You're actually engaged to that cowboy." "Not engaged yet, but promised." Hazel kept her voice level, refusing to be baited. "Hazel, I don't mean to be unkind, but don't you think this is all rather sudden? You barely know him. He could be anyone. What do you really know about Cade Turner?" Margaret's tone suggested she was being helpful, saving Hazel from her own foolishness. "I know enough." Hazel met Margaret's eyes steadily. "I know he's honest. I know he keeps his promises. I know he sees me, Margaret, really sees me." Margaret's face softened slightly, perhaps recognizing something genuine in Hazel's voice. "I hope you're right. I truly do. I'd hate to see you hurt." She paused, then added with unexpected sincerity, "You look different, you know. Happier, it suits you." After Margaret left, Hazel stood at her post behind the counter and realized that for the first time in her life, she didn't care what Margaret Sullivan or anyone else thought. Let them doubt. Let them whisper. She knew what she felt, knew what she'd seen in Cade's eyes. That was enough. The first letter arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by the mail coach driver who made his weekly rounds through Wild Rose Valley. Hazel's hand shook as she took the envelope, seeing her name written in Cade's careful script. She waited until the store was empty, then sat on the stool behind the counter and opened it with trembling fingers. "My dearest Hazel, we're camped tonight outside a town called Silver Creek, about 60 miles east of where I left you. 60 miles feels like 600 when every step takes me farther from where I want to be. I'm riding by firelight, the other men already asleep around me, and I keep thinking about that last evening we spent sitting on your back steps. I think I could live a whole lifetime in moments like that and die happy. How is your father? How is the store? I know these seem like mundane questions, but I want to know everything about your days. I want to picture where you are, what you're doing, when I'm lying under these stars missing you. The work here is hard but honest. We're moving a herd for a rancher who lost half his hands to gold fever. Fool's errand if you ask me, because the only gold I'm interested in is the band I plan to put on your finger come October. I'm saving every penny. Got it sewn into the lining of my saddlebag where no one can find it. By the time I see you again, I'll have enough for us to start properly. Dream of me if you can spare the time between all that running of your empire. I dream of you every night. Yours always, Cade." Hazel read the letter 3 times, pressing it against her chest between readings, feeling the physical evidence of his thoughts connecting across the distance. That evening, after closing the store and feeding her father, she sat at the small table in her room and composed her reply. The words came haltingly at first. She'd never written a love letter before, never imagined she'd have reason to, but once she started, they flowed like water finding its course. Dear Cade, your letter arrived today and I've read it so many times I can recite it from memory. 60 miles feels impossibly far, but knowing you're thinking of me makes it bearable. The store keeps me busy, which is both blessing and curse. Blessing because the days pass faster, curse because I want time to slow down so I can savor every moment leading up to October. My father has good days and bad days. On the good days, he asks about you. On the bad days, he forgets you exist. But he remembered enough on one good day to tell me that my mother would have liked you, and coming from him, that's everything. Mrs. Chen brought me fresh eggs yesterday and stayed to chat about her grandchildren, and I realized I was actually enjoying the conversation instead of just enduring it. You've changed something in me, Cade Turner. You've made me want to be part of the world again instead of just surviving in it. I do dream of you, every night, and I wake up reaching for something that isn't there yet, but will be. October feels both impossibly far away and terrifyingly close. What if you get here and realize you've made a mistake? What if, no? You told me not to think that way, and I'm trying. I'm trying to believe I'm worth coming back for. The ring sits on my finger like a promise, and I touch it 100 times a day to remind myself this is real. Stay safe. Come back to me. Yours, Hazel. The letters became a lifeline. Every week or two, sometimes more frequently, the mail coach would bring another envelope, and Hazel would devour Cade's words like sustenance. He wrote about the work, long days in the saddle, river crossings that went badly, nights so cold his coffee froze in the cup. But he also wrote about the beauty. Sunrises that painted the world in colors that had no names, the way a hawk circled overhead, like it was writing messages in the sky, the profound silence of the prairie at midnight, when it felt like he and the stars were the only things in existence. And he wrote about her, about how he couldn't see a wildflower without thinking of the sprig she'd worn in her hair, about how he'd told his sister Emily about her in his last letter, and Emily had written back saying she couldn't wait to meet the woman who'd finally captured her wandering brother's heart, about how he was counting the days, marking them off in a little notebook he kept in his pocket, 43 days until October, then 37, then 29. Hazel wrote back faithfully, filling her letters with the small details of her life that she'd never imagined anyone would care about. She told him about old Chester Malloy's rheumatism, about the barn cat that had kittens in the store's supply closet, about the traveling preacher who'd come through town and stayed for a week of revival meetings that had everyone stirred up and speaking in tongues. She told him about her fears, that the roof was getting worse, that her father was getting worse, that she sometimes woke up in the middle of the night certain this was all a dream and she'd wake to find herself alone again. Those fears are real, Cade wrote back. But so is this. So am I. So are we. Hold on to that when the doubts come calling. 6 weeks after Cade left, Hazel woke to discover her father hadn't gotten up. She found him on his cot, conscious but unable to move his left side, his face slack on one side, words coming out slurred and wrong. Doc Winters came quickly, examined him with gentle efficiency, then sat Hazel down in the store's back room with the kind of grave expression that preceded bad news. "He's had a stroke," Doc said bluntly, "a bad one. He might recover some function, but I doubt he'll ever be the same. You need to prepare yourself, Hazel. This could be the beginning of the end, or he could linger like this for months, maybe years. Either way, he's going to need constant care." The weight of it crashed over her like a wave. Constant care meant she couldn't run the store properly, couldn't serve customers while also watching him, making sure he ate, helping him to the privy, keeping him clean. The arithmetic was brutal and immediate. She'd have to hire help for the store, which meant money she didn't have, or close the store during the hours she tended him, which meant losing even more money they couldn't afford to lose. "How much would a nurse cost?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would be impossible. Doc Winters named a figure that made her stomach drop. "But I might know someone who could help part-time for less. Mrs. Kowalski, the widow on 3rd Street. Her husband died last year and she's looking for work. Good woman, patient, knows how to tend the sick. I can ask her if you'd like." "Yes, please." Hazel heard her own voice from far away. "Whatever we can afford." After Doc left, she sat beside her father's cot, holding his good hand, watching his chest rise and fall. His eyes tracked her face, and she could see the fear in them, the awareness that he was trapped in a body that no longer obeyed him. For the first time in years, she saw the man he'd been before grief had hollowed him out, her mother's husband, the father who'd taught her to read, who'd carried her on his shoulders when she was small. "I'm here, Papa," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out." But as the day wore into evening and she calculated the cost of a part-time nurse against the store's dwindling income, she felt the walls closing in. The roof still leaked, the wholesaler bill was still unpaid, and now there was this, her father's care, which would drain what little resources they had left. That night, after settling her father as comfortably as she could, Hazel climbed the stairs to her room and sat on her bed with the money box in her lap. $29.16. The sum of months of scrimping, of skipping meals, of choosing patches over new fabric. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She looked at the ring on her finger, the pearl glowing softly in the lamplight. It was old, clearly valuable. If she sold it, she could pay for months of nursing care, could fix the roof, could pay the wholesaler. She could solve every immediate problem crushing down on her. But she'd be breaking her promise. She'd be giving up the one beautiful thing in her life, the one piece of evidence that someone had chosen her, had seen worth in her. She'd be telling Cade that she didn't trust him, didn't believe he'd come back, that survival mattered more than love. Hazel twisted the ring around her finger, tears streaming down her face, torn between two impossible choices. She sat like that for hours, until the lamp burned low and the night grew cold, unable to decide, unable to see a way forward that didn't require sacrificing something essential. Finally, she slid the ring off her finger and held it in her palm. The pearl seemed to pulse with its own light, warm and alive. She thought about Cade's mother, whoever she'd been, wearing this ring through her own trials and joys. She thought about Cade carrying it for years, waiting for the right person. She thought about the promise it represented, that she wasn't alone, that someone was coming back for her, that her life could be more than just endurance. With shaking hands, she put the ring back on her finger and closed the money box. She'd find another way. She had to, because giving up this ring felt like giving up hope itself, and hope was the only thing keeping her breathing. Mrs. Kowalski started the next day, a sturdy Polish woman with strong hands and a no-nonsense manner that Hazel found immensely comforting. She charged half what Doc Winters had quoted, and she had a gentle way with Samuel that made him calmer, less frightened. With her coming for 4 hours each afternoon, Hazel could keep the store open longer, could serve customers properly instead of running back and forth in a panic. But the money bled away faster than she could earn it. By the end of the second week, Hazel was skipping supper, telling herself she wasn't hungry when really she was saving the food for her father. She wore her work dress until it was nearly transparent at the elbows, patched and repatched. She burned the lamp for only an hour after dark before forcing herself to bed, to save the kerosene. The letters from Cade continued, full of hope and plans and counting down days. 19 days until October, then 14, then 10. And Hazel wrote back, trying to keep her tone light, trying not to let him hear the desperation creeping into her voice. She told him about her father's stroke, but downplayed its severity. She told him about Mrs. Kowalski, but didn't mention what it cost. She told him she was fine, everything was fine. She was counting the days just like he was. She was lying, but what else could she do? Tell him the truth, that she was drowning, that every day was a choice between impossible options, that sometimes she looked at the ring and wondered if she was being selfish keeping it. He was 1,000 miles away, earning wages to build them a future. He couldn't help her with this, and burdening him with it felt cruel. The storm came in late August, unseasonably fierce, sweeping down from the mountains with winds that howled like demons. Hazel woke to the sound of something crashing, ran downstairs in her nightgown to find water pouring through the ceiling of the store, the old leak torn wide into a gaping hole. Rain sheeted through, soaking the merchandise, turning the wooden floor slick and dangerous. She worked through the night, dragging goods away from the water, setting out every pot and bucket she owned to catch the deluge, watching helplessly as her inventory, the goods she'd bought on credit, goods she couldn't afford to replace, turned soggy and ruined. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind devastating destruction. Half the store's stock was destroyed. The hole in the roof was big enough to see sky through, and the water had found its way into the walls, which meant rot, which meant structural damage she had no way to fix. Hazel stood in the middle of the sodden floor, water dripping from her soaked nightgown, and did the arithmetic. This was the end. Even if she sold everything salvageable, even if she worked 24 hours a day, she couldn't recover from this. The store was finished, her mother's legacy destroyed, all because she hadn't had the money to fix the roof when it was still a fixable problem. Mrs. Chen found her there an hour later, still standing in the water, shivering with cold and shock. The older woman took one look around and immediately took charge, wrapping Hazel in a blanket, making tea, sending her son to fetch Doc Winters and anyone else who could help. Within hours, half the town had gathered. Chester Malloy with his tools, the Morrison boys with spare lumber, Mrs. Fletcher bringing food, even Margaret Sullivan showing up with armfuls of old blankets to help dry the goods that could be saved. They worked together through the day, this small town that Hazel had always felt peripheral to, proving that she was more a part of them than she'd known. By evening, they'd cleared the water, salvaged what they could, and patched the roof well enough to keep out any future rain. Chester refused payment for his work, and when Hazel protested, he just patted her shoulder and said, "Your mama helped my wife when she was dying. This is just paying forward." That night, exhausted beyond measure, Hazel sat in her room and composed a letter to Cade. Her hand shook as she wrote, and for the first time she couldn't hide the truth. Dear Cade, something terrible has happened. There was a storm, and the roof gave way and destroyed half the store's inventory. The town helped me patch it, but the damage is done. I'm trying to calculate whether I can recover from this, and I don't think I can. I've been lying to you in my letters, saying everything is fine when it isn't. My father is getting worse, not better. The money is running out. Some days I'm not sure how we'll make it to next week, much less October. I don't know why I'm telling you this now. Maybe because I'm too tired to pretend anymore. Maybe because I need you to know that if you've changed your mind about coming back, I'd understand. You signed up for a girl running a store, not a girl who's drowning in debt with a dying father and a business that's barely surviving. I'm not trying to release you from your promise. God knows I'm selfish enough to want you to keep it, but I need you to know what you'd be coming back to. The truth, not the pretty version I've been painting in my letters. I love you. That's the one thing I haven't lied about. But love doesn't pay debts or fix roofs or bring back stock that's been ruined by rainwater. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what else to say except that I'll understand if you decide this is too much. Hazel. She sealed the letter and sent it with the next mail coach, then spent the following days in a haze of exhaustion and dread. She worked the store during every hour it was open, tended her father when Mrs. Kowalski wasn't there, fell into bed each night too tired even for dreams. The ring felt heavy on her finger, a reminder of promises that seemed increasingly impossible to keep. 8 days until October. Then 6. Then 4. No letter came from Cade. The silence stretched, and with each passing day, Hazel felt something inside her harden. He'd gotten her letter, realized what a mess he'd be inheriting, and decided to cut his losses. She couldn't blame him. What sane man would choose this life? A dying father-in-law, a failing business, a woman who couldn't even keep a roof over her head. She should take off the ring, should pack it away, add it to the box of broken dreams, and move on. But her fingers wouldn't obey. Every time she reached to slide it off, something in her chest clenched so hard she couldn't breathe. 3 days until October. Hazel was restocking the shelves, what little stock remained, when the bell chimed. She turned, expecting a customer, and found herself facing a tall man in a fine suit, his face weathered but genteel, a businessman's shrewdness in his eyes. "Miss Wren?" he said, removing his hat. "My name is Theodore Blackwood. I own the Mercantile in Blackwater, and I've been keeping an eye on your operation here. I'd like to make you an offer." Hazel's stomach dropped. She knew what was coming before he said it. "Your store is in trouble," Blackwood continued, not unkindly. "I've seen the invoices. You're 3 months behind with the wholesaler, and after that storm, you're in no position to recover. I'd like to buy you out, absorb your remaining inventory, take over the building, settle your debts. You'd be free and clear, able to take care of your father without this burden dragging you down." "This was my mother's store," Hazel said quietly. "It's all I have of her." "I understand, but your mother wouldn't want you to drown with it." Blackwood's voice was gentle, persuasive. "I'll give you a fair price, more than fair actually, because I admire what you've tried to do here. Enough to pay off your debts and have a cushion left over. You could start fresh somewhere else without all this weight on your shoulders." He named a figure. It was generous, she had to admit. More than she'd expected. Enough to clear her debts, pay for her father's care for months, maybe even start over somewhere new. All she had to do was let go, admit defeat, surrender the last piece of her mother's legacy and the only life she'd ever known. "I need time to think," she managed. "Of course. But I'll need an answer soon. I have other opportunities I'm considering. Shall we say 3 days, October 1st? He smiled, not unkindly. "Think about it, Miss Wren. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is know when to let go." After he left, Hazel stood in the store that had been her entire world for 20 years, looking at the shelves her mother had built, the counter where her mother had taught her arithmetic, the window where her mother used to place fresh flowers every morning. If she sold, all of that would be gone, erased, replaced by Theodore Blackwood's efficient mercantile operation. But if she didn't sell, she'd lose it anyway. The math was inescapable. She couldn't make enough to survive, let alone pay her debts. The store was already dying. Blackwood's offer was just acknowledging what she'd been refusing to admit. That evening, Hazel sat beside her father's cot and told him about the offer. He looked at her with his one good eye, the other still slack and useless, and squeezed her hand with his functioning fingers. "What your mother want?" he managed to slur out. Hazel felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know, Papa. I think she'd want me to be happy, but I don't know what that looks like anymore." 2 days until October. The silence from Cade stretched like an open wound. Hazel found herself standing at the window during slow moments, watching the road the way she'd sworn she wouldn't, hoping against hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd come early, that he'd ride in with some solution she couldn't see, that he'd make everything right. But the road stayed empty. October 1st arrived gray and cold, the first real hint of the winter coming. Hazel opened the store mechanically, going through familiar motions that felt like saying goodbye. Today was the day Blackwood wanted his answer. Today was also the day Cade had promised to return, though the sun was already past noon and there was no sign of him. She'd been a fool to hope. Cowboys made promises easily and broke them just as easily. He was probably halfway to California by now. Or maybe he'd met some pretty girl in one of the towns along his route, someone without crushing debts and dying fathers, someone who could smile without it feeling like work. The ring on her finger suddenly felt like mockery. She twisted it around, preparing to finally take it off, to pack it away with all her other broken dreams when the bell chimed. Hazel looked up, expecting Blackwood come for his answer, and froze. Cade stood in the doorway, travel-worn and dusty, his face haggard with exhaustion, but his eyes, those amber eyes that haunted her dreams, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "I got your letter," he said, his voice rough. 10 days ago, I got your letter, and I rode straight through to get here. Changed horses 3 times, damn near killed myself getting back." He took a step forward, then another, crossing the store like he was crossing a battlefield. "And the whole way here, I kept thinking about what you wrote, that you'd understand if I changed my mind, that I might decide this was too much." Hazel couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. This was it, the moment where he told her gently that he couldn't do this, couldn't take on her disasters, couldn't love someone whose life was falling apart. But Cade kept coming until he stood right in front of her, and the expression on his face wasn't retreat. It was fierce, determined, almost angry. "Did you really think," he said quietly, "that a damaged roof would scare me away? That debt would make me love you less? That I'd hear your life was hard and decide you weren't worth it?" He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Hazel Wren, I don't love you because your life is easy. I love you because you're the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever met. I love you because you carry impossible weight and you keep going. I love you because when I look at you, I see home." "The store is dying," she whispered. "There's a man who wants to buy it. I think I have to sell. Everything my mother built, everything I've tried to save, it's all falling apart, Cade." "Then we'll let it fall," he said simply, "and we'll build something new from the pieces. Together." He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with coins. "I saved every penny, every single penny from 3 months of work. It's not a fortune, but it's a start. We can pay your debts, fix the roof properly, restock the shelves, or we can sell to Blackwood and start something completely new. I don't care which we do, Hazel. All I care about is doing it with you." She stared at the pouch in his hand, at the evidence of months of labor and sacrifice, at the proof that he'd meant every word he'd ever said to her. "You'd give this to me? Your whole season's wages?" "I'd give you everything." His voice broke slightly. "Don't you understand that yet? I came back for you, Hazel. Not for the store, not for the town, not for anything except you. Marry me. Right now, today. Say yes, and we'll figure out the rest together." And there it was, the question she'd been waiting for, dreaming of, terrified of. Not the promise of a future proposal, but the actual, real question, offered in the ruins of her old life with the courage to build a new one. Hazel looked at this man who'd ridden through exhaustion to reach her, who'd saved his wages not for himself but for them, who was standing in her dying store offering not rescue but partnership. She looked at the ring on her finger that she'd refused to take off even when everything else was falling apart. She looked at the store that had been her prison and her purpose, and realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to choose something else. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Cade's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. He kissed her then, deep and desperate and full of relief, his arms wrapping around her like he could hold back the whole world as long as she was in them. And Hazel kissed him back, pouring 3 months of fear and loneliness and hope into it, letting herself believe that maybe happiness was possible, maybe love was real, maybe she deserved this after all. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cade rested his forehead against hers. "We're going to be all right," he said firmly. "Whatever we decide about the store, whatever comes next, we're going to be all right." "How can you be so sure?" "Because," he said, pulling back to look into her eyes, "we have each other, and that's more than enough to build a life on." The bell chimed again, and they turned to find Theodore Blackwood standing in the doorway, taking in the scene with raised eyebrows. "Miss Wren, I've come for your answer about my offer." Hazel looked at Cade, who squeezed her hand but left the decision to her. She thought about her mother, about the store that had been everything to her family for 2 decades. But she also thought about what her mother had really valued, not the building or the inventory, but family, love, the courage to make hard choices. "Mr. Blackwood," she said steadily, "I appreciate your offer, but I'm going to decline. This store was my mother's dream, and I'm not ready to let it go just yet. With my fiancé's help, I think we can turn things around." Blackwood looked between them, then nodded slowly. "I understand. The offer stands if you change your mind." He tipped his hat and left, his footsteps fading into the afternoon. Cade turned to her, eyebrows raised. "Are you sure? We could take his money, start fresh without all this debt." "I'm sure." And surprisingly, she was. "This store is part of who I am, part of us now. If we can save it, I want to try. But if we can't—" She took a breath. "If we can't, then we'll let it go and build something new, together." "Together," Cade agreed and kissed her again. That evening, they sat with her father and told him their plans: to marry as soon as the traveling preacher came through again, to use Cade's wages to settle the debts and repair the store, to build a life together in Wild Rose Valley. Samuel Wren squeezed Cade's hand with his good one and managed to slur out something that sounded like blessing and good man. Later, alone in the quiet after-closing hours, Cade and Hazel sat on the back steps under a sky brilliant with stars, planning their future in low voices, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. The store might still fail, her father might still die. Winter was coming and money would be tight. But for the first time in years, Hazel wasn't facing it alone. "What are you thinking?" Cade asked softly. Hazel looked at the ring on her finger, then up at the stars, then at the man beside her who'd kept every impossible promise. "I'm thinking that I was wrong about myself, about what I deserve, about what my life could be." "And what's that?" She smiled, and it felt natural, easy, true. "This. Exactly this." He kissed her temple, tightened his arm around her. "Then let's make sure you get it, every day, for the rest of our lives." And sitting there in the dark, with autumn turning toward winter, and the future uncertain but no longer terrifying, Hazel Wren finally understood what it meant to be loved. Not for being perfect or pretty or easy, but for being herself, strong and scared and stubborn and brave, all at once. Worthy not because someone had finally seen her, but because she'd always been worth seeing. She just hadn't believed it until Cade Turner walked into her store and refused to look away. The traveling preacher arrived in Wild Rose Valley on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Cade's return, driving a wagon painted with faded scripture verses and pulled by a mule that looked as tired as he did. Reverend Calloway was a weathered man in his 60s who'd been making the circuit through frontier towns for 30 years, marrying couples, baptizing babies, and burying the dead with equal parts solemnity and efficiency. He'd married Hazel's parents 23 years ago in this same town, and when Hazel approached him about conducting a wedding, his creased face broke into a genuine smile. "Rebecca Wren's girl," he said, clasping her hands warmly. "I remember your mother. Fine woman, strong faith. She'd be happy to see you settled." His eyes moved to Cade, standing protectively close to Hazel's side. This the young man? Cade Turner, sir. Cade extended his hand. I'd be honored if you'd marry us. How long you known each other? Not long by calendar measure, Cade admitted, but long enough to be certain. Reverend Calloway studied them both with eyes that had seen countless frontier romances, some that lasted, many that didn't. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly. I'll be in town through Sunday. That give you enough time to prepare? More than enough, Hazel said, and meant it. She didn't need a fancy wedding with months of planning. She just needed to be Cade's wife, to make official what her heart had already decided. The news spread through Wild Rose Valley like wildfire. Mrs. Chen immediately appointed herself coordinator of the event, enlisting Mrs. Fletcher for the wedding breakfast, organizing the church ladies to prepare the small community chapel, and generally treating Hazel's wedding as if it were the social event of the season. Margaret Sullivan came by the store with an unexpected offer. I know we haven't always been close, Margaret said, choosing her words carefully, but I'd like to lend you my wedding dress. It needs letting out. You're taller than me, but Mrs. Chen is handy with a needle, and it would be a shame for you to marry in calico when you don't have to. Hazel was so surprised she almost refused out of pure habit, but something in Margaret's expression, genuine kindness without any undercurrent of superiority, made her reconsider. That's incredibly generous. Are you sure? I'm sure. Matthew and I will be married in Denver with all the fancy trimmings, but you're marrying for love, Hazel. Real love. The kind that rides through exhaustion and saves wages and shows up when it promises to. Margaret's voice softened. That's worth celebrating properly. So Hazel found herself standing in Mrs. Chen's parlor while the older woman pinned and tucked Margaret Sullivan's cream-colored dress, letting out the bodice and adding length to the hem with carefully preserved lace from Mrs. Chen's own wedding dress. The result was simple but lovely, elegant in its plainness, and when Hazel looked at herself in Mrs. Chen's full-length mirror, she barely recognized the woman looking back. You see? Mrs. Chen said softly, standing behind her. Beautiful. Always were. Just needed someone to help you see it. The days leading to Sunday passed in a blur of preparation and work. Cade threw himself into repairing the store with an energy that bordered on possessed. He patched the roof properly this time, replacing rotten boards and sealing every leak. He reorganized the stockroom, built new shelves to replace the water-damaged ones, and repainted the exterior with paint he'd bought with part of his wages. Chester Malloy and the Morrison boys helped, refusing payment but accepting Hazel's tearful gratitude. The store itself began to transform. Cade used the rest of his wages to settle the debt with the wholesaler and place a new order. Conservative, practical, but enough to fill the shelves again. He kept meticulous records in the ledger, his neat handwriting appearing beside Hazel's cramped script, their two styles merging on the page the way their lives were merging in reality. You're good at this, Hazel observed one evening, watching him calculate margins and compare supplier prices. The business side of things. I thought you were just a cowboy. Cade looked up from the ledger with a slight smile. My father ran a ranch, remember? Before it failed, I spent years watching him manage stock and negotiate deals. I know numbers. He reached across the table and took her hand. We make a good team, you and I. You know the customers, the community, what people need. I know the business operations, the supply chains, how to make the numbers work. Together, we might actually make this place thrive instead of just survive. Together, Hazel repeated, loving the sound of that word more each time she heard it. But not everything was smooth sailing. Her father's condition continued to deteriorate. Mrs. Kowalski came daily now, her services paid for with part of Cade's wages, but even her competent care couldn't stop Samuel Wren's slow decline. He had moments of clarity where he seemed almost himself, asking about the store, trying to smile when Cade visited, even attempting to give fatherly advice in his slurred, difficult speech. But those moments grew fewer and farther between, separated by longer stretches of confusion and exhaustion. 3 days before the wedding, Hazel sat beside her father's cot in the quiet evening hours, holding his hand and talking to him, even though she wasn't sure how much he understood. I wish you could walk me down the aisle, Papa. I wish Mama could be here to see this. I wish... Her voice broke. I wish so many things were different. Samuel's good hand squeezed hers with surprising strength. His mouth worked for a moment before words came out, clearer than they'd been in weeks. Happy. Your mother would be so happy. Good man. Let him love you. I will, Papa. I promise. Not your fault, he continued, each word a struggle. Store. My drinking. All my fault. You were good daughter. Best daughter. Tears leaked from his eyes. Sorry. So sorry. Hazel laid her head on his chest and cried, feeling his good hand stroke her hair with trembling fingers, offering what comfort he could. When Mrs. Kowalski arrived for her shift, she found them like that and quietly withdrew to give them privacy. That night was the last time Samuel Wren spoke in complete sentences, and Hazel was grateful beyond measure that those final clear words had been absolution. Sunday arrived cool and bright, autumn asserting itself with golden light and air that tasted like wood smoke. Hazel woke before dawn in her small room above the store, her wedding dress hanging on the wardrobe door like a ghost of better things. She sat on her bed for a long moment, touching the pearl ring on her finger, thinking about the girl she'd been 4 months ago, plain, resigned, certain her life would be nothing but duty and survival. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who'd learned she could be loved, could be chosen, could be seen as beautiful by someone whose opinion actually mattered to her. The transformation still felt fragile, like something that might shatter if she examined it too closely, but it was real. Cade had made it real. Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Fletcher arrived at 8 to help her dress, fussing over her hair and the fit of the dress, chattering about the breakfast waiting at the boarding house and how the whole town planned to attend the ceremony. Margaret Sullivan came too, ostensibly to see her dress, but really, Hazel suspected, to be part of something genuine after so many months of planning her own elaborate society wedding. You look beautiful, Hazel, Margaret said quietly as Mrs. Chen finished pinning Hazel's hair into a soft arrangement with wildflowers woven through it. Cade's request, apparently, passed through Mrs. Chen. Really, truly beautiful. I'm glad I was wrong about him. Wrong about what? I thought he'd break your heart. Margaret's smile was rueful. Instead, he fixed it. That's rare, you know. Hold on to it. I intend to. The chapel was small, barely more than a one-room building with rough-hewn pews and a simple cross on the wall. But someone, probably Mrs. Chen's doing, had filled it with autumn flowers and late-blooming wildflowers. The whole town seemed to have turned out, packing the pews and spilling out the door. Old Chester Malloy was there, and Doc Winters, and the Chen family in their Sunday best, and the Morrisons, and even Theodore Blackwood offering a respectful nod when Hazel entered. But Hazel barely saw any of them. Her eyes found Cade standing at the front beside Reverend Calloway, and the rest of the world faded to insignificance. He wore a new suit, or new to him anyway, probably bought or borrowed from somewhere, and he'd shaved and tamed his hair, though one stubborn curl still fell across his forehead. But it was his expression that stopped her heart, pure, undiluted joy mixed with something that looked almost like awe. She walked down the aisle alone because her father couldn't manage it, and somehow that felt right. She'd been walking alone for years. But this time, she was walking toward something instead of just through it, toward Cade, toward partnership, toward a life that might actually include happiness. When she reached him, Cade took both her hands in his and mouthed, "Beautiful," and Hazel had to blink back tears to keep her vision clear. Reverend Calloway's voice carried through the small chapel, reading the familiar words about marriage and partnership and covenant. But when he reached the vows, he paused and looked at them both seriously. "I've married a lot of couples in my time," he said, departing from the script. "Some for land, some for convenience, some because it was expected. But every now and then, I get to marry 2 people who found something real, something worth fighting for. That's what I see here today." He turned to Cade. "Young man, do you promise to honor this woman, to stand by her in hardship and joy, to be her partner in all things, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Cade said, his voice strong and certain. "I promise all of that, and more." "And Hazel," Reverend Calloway continued, "do you promise to honor this man, to trust him with your heart, to build a life together, for as long as you both shall live?" Hazel looked into Cade's amber eyes and saw her entire future reflected there. Challenges and triumphs, ordinary days and extraordinary moments, all of it made bearable and beautiful by the presence of the man standing before her. I do. With everything I am, I do. Then by the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. Young man, you may kiss your bride. Cade pulled her close and kissed her thoroughly, not chastely, drawing laughter and a few scandalized gasps from the assembled crowd. When he finally released her, his smile was absolutely triumphant. Mine, he whispered against her lips. Finally, mine. Finally ours, she corrected, and kissed him again. The wedding breakfast at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house was a raucous, joyful affair, with more food than seemed possible for a town this size to produce. There was roast chicken and ham, fresh bread and butter, 3 kinds of pie, and a small wedding cake that Mrs. Chen had somehow managed to conjure. People came up to offer congratulations, to shake Cade's hand, to kiss Hazel's cheek, and tell her how happy they were for her. You did good, girl, Chester Malloy said, clasping her shoulder with a gnarled hand. Your mama would be proud. Doc Winters pulled Cade aside for a quiet word that Hazel couldn't hear, but when Cade returned to her side, his expression was somber. He says your father doesn't have long. Maybe weeks, maybe days. I'm sorry, Hazel. The news should have devastated her, but somehow it felt like relief mixed with sadness. Her father had been dying by inches for years, first from grief, then from drink, finally from his stroke. Death would be mercy at this point, release from a body that had become a prison. Then we'll make sure he's comfortable. That's all we can do. They spent their wedding night in Hazel's small room above the store because they couldn't afford to go anywhere else and wouldn't have wanted to even if they could. Samuel Wren slept in the back room with Mrs. Kowalski watching over him. The store was quiet, settled, waiting for morning. Hazel stood by the window in the borrowed nightgown Mrs. Chen had provided, looking out at the darkened street, feeling the weight of the day settling over her. She was married. Hazel Wren, no, Hazel Turner now, was married to a man who loved her, who'd chosen her, who'd proven over and over that he meant every promise he made. Having second thoughts? Cade asked softly from where he sat on the bed, watching her. She turned to face him, this man who was now her husband, and shook her head. No second thoughts. Just trying to believe it's real, that this isn't some dream I'll wake up from tomorrow. He stood and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. It's real. I'm real. He gestured to the room, the store below, the life they were building. All of it is real. And tomorrow we wake up together and we keep making it real day by day. Day by day, she repeated, and let him lead her to bed, to the beginning of their life as husband and wife, to the physical expression of everything they'd promised each other in words. The weeks that followed established new rhythms. Cade proved to be everything he'd promised, a partner in every sense. He rose early to help open the store, spent his days serving customers with the same quiet courtesy he'd shown Hazel that first evening, and closed each night by reviewing the ledgers with her, planning their next moves, strategizing how to grow the business. They worked side by side, learning each other's habits and quirks, developing the comfortable shorthand of couples who functioned as a unit. Mrs. Chen taught Cade how to deal with the particular demands of the Chinese community in Wild Rose Valley, customers Hazel had served for years but never fully understood. Doc Winters showed him which medicinal supplies to keep in stock and in what quantities. Chester Malloy introduced him around to the ranchers who came to town quarterly for supplies, building relationships that would matter when it came time to secure large orders. And slowly, painfully slowly, the store began to turn a profit. Not much at first, just a few dollars here and there after all expenses were paid. But those few dollars went into a jar that sat on a shelf in their bedroom, marked Future in Hazel's careful script. The jar filled slowly, but it filled. Samuel Wren lingered longer than Doc Winters predicted, as if his body refused to surrender even when his mind had largely left. There were still good days when his eyes would track Hazel as she moved around his room, when he'd squeeze Cade's hand in what might have been gratitude or blessing. But mostly he slept, his breathing growing shallower and more labored with each passing week. Hazel sat with him every evening, reading aloud from the Bible or her mother's favorite poems, telling him about the store and the town and how well Cade was fitting in. Whether he heard or understood didn't matter. She needed to say the words, needed to fill the silence with something other than the sound of his dying. It was Cade who found her one night sitting beside her father's cot, tears streaming silently down her face while Samuel slept on, oblivious. He didn't say anything, just pulled up a chair beside her and took her hand, sitting vigil with her in the lamplit dimness. "I should be relieved," Hazel whispered finally. "He's been gone for so long anyway. This will just make it official. But I keep thinking about who he was before Mama died. The father he used to be." "You can mourn both," Cade said quietly. "The father you lost to grief and the father you're losing to death. Both losses are real." "How did you get so wise?" "Lost my own parents, remember? I know what it's like to watch someone disappear by inches and not be able to stop it." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "But I also know that life goes on. Not in spite of the grief, but alongside it. We carry our dead with us, Hazel. They become part of who we are." Samuel Wren died on a cold November morning, slipping away so quietly that Mrs. Kowalski didn't realize he'd gone until she tried to wake him for his breakfast. She came to find Hazel in the store, her round face solemn with sympathy, and delivered the news with simple directness. "Your papa's passed, dear, peacefully in his sleep. He didn't suffer." Hazel felt the news like a physical blow despite knowing it was coming. Cade was there instantly, his arms around her, holding her upright while the world tilted and righted itself. She didn't cry, not then. The tears would come later, she knew, in unexpected moments when grief ambushed her. But right then she felt only a strange, hollow relief mixed with exhausting sadness. They buried Samuel Wren beside his wife in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Wild Rose Valley. The whole town turned out again, offering condolences and casseroles, the same community support they'd shown for the wedding, now directed toward mourning. Reverend Calloway spoke words about resurrection and reunion, about a man who'd loved deeply and grieved deeply and now was at peace. Standing beside the grave with Cade's arm around her waist, Hazel looked at her parents' headstones. Rebecca Wren, beloved wife and mother, and now Samuel Wren, beloved husband and father, and felt the weight of their legacy settling onto her shoulders. The store was hers now, truly hers. Theirs, she corrected herself, glancing at Cade, theirs to shape and build and transform. "What are you thinking?" Cade asked as they walked back down the hill after the burial, the November wind cutting through their coats. "I'm thinking that this is the end of something," Hazel said slowly. "My father's death, my old life, all the years of just surviving. But it's also a beginning, isn't it? We get to decide what comes next." "We do." Cade pulled her closer against the cold. "So what do we want? What does the future look like?" Hazel was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I want the store to thrive, not just survive. I want to be part of this community instead of just serving it. I want—" She paused, then continued more softly. "I want children someday. A family. I want our children to grow up knowing they're loved, that they matter, that they're beautiful regardless of what the world tells them." Cade stopped walking and turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness. "Then that's what we'll build. All of it. Together." The winter months tested them in ways the summer and fall hadn't. Business slowed as the weather turned brutal, and customers stayed home unless they absolutely needed supplies. The store grew cold despite their best efforts to heat it, forcing them to huddle close to the small stove in the back room during the slowest hours. Money was tight again, though not desperately so, and they learned to stretch every dollar, to make do, to find joy in small economies. But they also learned each other. Learned that Cade was grumpy before his morning coffee, but sweet after. Learned that Hazel had nightmares sometimes and needed to be held without questions. Learned to fight fair when they disagreed about store decisions or how to manage their meager budget. Learning that marriage meant negotiation and compromise, and sometimes just agreeing to trust the other person's judgment. "You're stubborn," Cade said one evening after a particularly spirited debate about whether to extend credit to the Morrison family, who'd fallen on hard times. "You're soft-hearted," Hazel countered. "We can't afford to extend credit to everyone who asks." "But the Morrisons helped us rebuild after the storm. Doesn't that mean something?" Hazel sighed, recognizing truth when she heard it. You're right. We'll extend them credit. But only this once, and only because they helped us when we needed it. We can't make this a habit. Agreed. Cade pulled her into his lap, kissing her temple. See? We're learning to work together. We'd better be. We're stuck with each other now. Stuck is the wrong word, he murmured against her hair. Blessed, chosen, lucky, but never stuck. Christmas came, and they scraped together enough money for small gifts. A new ledger for the store, a warm scarf for Cade, a shawl for Hazel that he'd traded work at the livery stable to afford. They spent Christmas morning in bed later than usual, luxuriating in the rare freedom of keeping the store closed for a holiday, then opened it for a few hours in the afternoon for customers who needed last-minute supplies. Mrs. Chen brought them dinner, a roasted goose and all the trimmings, and stayed to eat with them, filling the store's back room with laughter and stories about her grandchildren and gentle questions about when Hazel and Cade might start their own family. Hazel blushed but didn't discourage the speculation. It was too soon yet. They'd only been married 2 months, but the seed of the idea had been planted and was growing. January brought word that Theodore Blackwood's mercantile in Blackwater had burned down, a complete loss. The news sent ripples through the frontier merchant community, and suddenly Hazel and Cade found themselves receiving orders from customers who'd previously made the trip to Blackwater for their supplies. It wasn't a fortune, but it was significant, enough to refill the future jar and start thinking seriously about expansion. We could add another room, Cade suggested one evening, sketching plans in the margin of the ledger. Expand the dry goods section. Maybe add a proper office so we're not working at the kitchen table. That would take money we don't have yet, Hazel said cautiously, though her heart raced at the possibility. Then we save for it. We plan for it. We make it happen. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Hazel found herself smiling despite her natural caution. All right, let's make it happen. February brought a surprise visitor, a well-dressed woman in her mid-20s who arrived on the afternoon coach with 2 large trunks and an uncertain smile. She pushed open the store's door and looked around with bright, curious eyes that bore a striking resemblance to Cade's. Is there a Cade Turner working here? She asked, her accent marking her as city-educated. I'm looking for my brother. Cade emerged from the stockroom carrying a crate and froze when he saw her. Emily? Hello, Cade. Her smile widened. Surprise? What followed was a chaos of introductions and explanations. Emily Turner had completed her teaching certificate and been offered a position at the new school in Wild Rose Valley, a position she'd accepted without telling Cade because she'd wanted to surprise him, and also because after months of receiving letters about the remarkable Hazel Wren, she'd wanted to meet this woman who'd captured her wandering brother's heart. He wrote about you constantly, Emily told Hazel over dinner that evening, her eyes twinkling. Every letter was, Hazel did this, and Hazel said that, and you should see how strong she is. I started to think you must be some kind of frontier saint. Hardly, Hazel said, but she was smiling. Your brother tends toward exaggeration when it comes to me. No exaggeration, Cade interjected firmly. Just truth. Emily stayed with them for 2 weeks while she settled into her new position and found lodgings with Mrs. Fletcher at the boarding house. But she was at the store constantly, helping with customers, offering suggestions for improving the display of goods, and most importantly, becoming the sister Hazel had never had. They fell into easy friendship, united by their affection for Cade and their shared determination to make lives for themselves on the frontier. He loves you so much it's almost embarrassing, Emily confided one afternoon when Cade was out making deliveries. I've never seen him like this. When our mother died, something in him shut down. He stopped believing in permanent things, stopped letting himself hope. You brought him back to life. He did the same for me, Hazel said quietly. I thought I was done, thought my life was already decided, already lived. Then he walked into my store and everything changed. That's how you know it's real, Emily said wisely, when someone doesn't just fit into your life but transforms it completely. By March, the store was thriving in ways Hazel had never imagined possible. They'd become the primary supplier for 3 surrounding ranches, were doing steady business with the growing Chinese community, and had even started a small lending library in one corner. Emily's idea, implemented with books donated from her personal collection and a few purchased with store profits. The future jar was nearly full, and Cade had started pricing lumber for the expansion. But the real transformation wasn't in the store's profits or the building's improvements. It was in Hazel herself. She caught glimpses of it in mirrors, the way she stood straighter now, smiled more readily, met people's eyes instead of looking away. The way she'd stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped assuming people's kindness was pity. She was learning, slowly and incompletely, to see herself the way Cade saw her, as someone worthy of love, of happiness, of a life that was more than mere survival. One evening in late March, she was restocking shelves when she became aware of Cade watching her from the doorway, his expression soft and wondering. She turned to face him, self-conscious under his gaze. "What?" "Nothing, just looking at my wife and marveling that I get to keep her." He crossed to her, pulled her into his arms despite the impropriety of doing so in the store where anyone might walk in. "Do you know what today is? Wednesday? It's 6 months since I first walked into this store and saw you standing behind that counter. 6 months since my life changed completely." His voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, Hazel. Thank you for believing we could build something beautiful out of very little." "We did build something beautiful," she corrected, "and we're not done yet." "No," he agreed, his hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach with pointed meaning. "We're definitely not done yet." Hazel's breath caught. They'd been trying for the past 2 months, hoping and not quite daring to hope. "Cade, I don't know for sure, but maybe." His eyes searched hers, full of tentative joy. "Maybe?" "Maybe," she admitted, and watched his face transform with happiness, so pure it made her chest ache. That night, lying in their bed with Cade's arm around her, and his hand still resting protectively on her stomach, Hazel thought about the girl she'd been just 6 months ago. The girl who'd believed beauty belonged to other women, who'd resigned herself to duty and survival, who'd thought love was something that happened to lucky people in stories but never in real life. That girl was gone, replaced by this woman who'd learned that beauty wasn't about perfect features or unmarked hands. It was about courage and resilience and the willingness to hope even when hope seemed foolish. It was about being seen, really seen, by someone who looked past surfaces to the truth beneath. "What are you thinking about?" Cade murmured sleepily. "About how much has changed. How much I've changed." She turned in his arms to face him. "A year ago, if you told me I'd be married to a man who loves me, running a thriving store, possibly pregnant with our first child, I wouldn't have believed it. It would have seemed like impossible fantasy. And now? Now it's just my life. Our life." She smiled in the darkness. "Our beautiful, impossible, real life." "Beautiful, impossible, and real," Cade repeated, pulling her closer. "That's exactly what it is. And tomorrow, we wake up and keep building it, day by day, the way we always have." "Day by day," Hazel agreed, and let sleep claim her, secure in the knowledge that she was no longer facing her days alone, no longer simply surviving them, but actually living, fully, deeply, joyfully living, in the life she and Cade were building together. Spring arrived tentatively, then with sudden conviction, flooding Wild Rose Valley with wildflowers and possibilities. Hazel's suspicions about pregnancy were confirmed by Doc Winters in early April, and the news transformed everything once again. Cade became almost comically protective, refusing to let her lift anything heavier than a teacup, insisting she rest every afternoon, driving her to distraction with his hovering until she finally had to sit him down and explain firmly that women had been having babies while running businesses since the beginning of time, and she had no intention of becoming an invalid for 9 months. "I'm trying to take care of you," he protested, looking genuinely wounded. "I know, and I love you for it, but I need you to trust that I know my own body, my own limits." She took his hands in hers, softening her tone. "This baby is a blessing, not an illness. Let me work. Let me live. Just stay close in case I need you." "I'm always close," he promised, and proved it by staying within arm's reach whenever possible, a constant warm presence that Hazel found herself leaning into more than she'd expected. Emily was ecstatic about becoming an aunt. immediately beginning plans to knit booties and blankets, pestering them about names, speculating about whether the baby would have Cade's eyes or Hazel's determination. Mrs. Chen organized the town women to prepare a layette, and suddenly Hazel found herself the recipient of more kindness and attention than she'd received in her entire life. It was overwhelming and wonderful and occasionally suffocating, but mostly it made her realize how much she'd become part of this community instead of just existing on its edges. The store expansion began in May. Cade and Chester Malloy, along with the Morrison boys, whose debt had been paid in full with help from their good harvest, worked through the lengthening days to add a proper stockroom and a small office with a real desk and filing cabinets Cade had ordered from a catalog. The sound of hammering and sawing became the soundtrack to Hazel's days, a constant reminder that they were building something permanent, something that would last beyond them. "This will be for our children," Cade said one evening, showing her the new sign he'd commissioned. It read, "Turner and Wren General Goods," in fresh black paint on a white background, professional and proud. "When they're old enough, they'll work here beside us. They'll learn the business, learn to serve the community, learn what it means to build something with your own hands." "You're assuming they'll want to," Hazel said, but she was smiling. "What if they want to be teachers like Emily, or doctors, or cowboys like their father used to be? Then they'll be whatever they want to be because we'll give them that choice." Cade's hand found her still small belly, his touch gentle and reverent. "But they'll always know this place exists, that their parents built something out of love and determination and refusing to give up when things got hard." The new sign went up on a bright June morning, and half the town showed up to watch, cheering as Cade and Chester hoisted it into place above the door. Mrs. Fletcher brought lemonade, Mrs. Chen brought cookies, and someone suggested a grand reopening celebration for the expanded store. Within hours, plans were underway for a community event that kept growing in scope until it threatened to become the social highlight of the summer. "This is getting out of hand," Hazel said to Emily, watching Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Fletcher argue good-naturedly about whether to serve beef or pork at the celebration supper. "Let them have their fun," Emily advised. "They love you, Hazel, both of you. This town has watched you transform from a lonely girl barely holding on to a thriving businesswoman expecting her first child. They want to celebrate that. Let them." So Hazel let them, and on a warm Saturday in late June, Turner and Wren General Goods held its grand reopening with bunting and music and more food than seemed possible for a town this size to produce. Nearly everyone in Wild Rose Valley attended, along with folks from neighboring settlements who'd heard about the improvements and wanted to see for themselves. They toured the expanded space, admired the new fixtures, exclaimed over the improved organization and the lending library that was Emily's pride. Theodore Blackwood showed up unexpectedly, having made the trip from where he was rebuilding in Blackwater. He shook Cade's hand warmly and pulled Hazel aside for a private word. "I'm glad you didn't sell to me," he said with genuine warmth. "Watching what you've built here, what you've become. This is what frontier enterprise should look like. Community-focused, personal, built on relationships rather than just profit. You've created something special, Mrs. Turner." "We've created it," Hazel corrected gently. "Cade and I together. I couldn't have done any of this alone." "But you're not alone anymore, are you? That's the real success story here." Blackwood tipped his hat and moved away to examine the new stockroom, leaving Hazel standing in the midst of her crowded store, surrounded by community and celebration, feeling the baby flutter for the first time beneath her ribs. She pressed her hand to her stomach, tears pricking her eyes at the sensation. Life. New life, growing inside her. The physical manifestation of everything she and Cade had built together. Hope made flesh. Love made tangible. "You all right?" Cade materialized at her side, always attuned to her moods. "The baby moved," she whispered, taking his hand and pressing it to where she'd felt the flutter. "Just now, the baby moved." His face transformed with wonder. They stood there in the middle of the celebration, hands pressed together over their growing child, and Hazel felt a completeness she'd never known was possible. This was home. This was family. This was the life she'd never dared dream of, manifest and real and hers. But Summer's joy was tempered by unexpected challenge. In July, a bank panic in the East sent ripples through even small frontier communities. Credit tightened, customers who'd been paying on account suddenly found themselves unable to pay at all, and several of the ranches that had been steady customers had to reduce their orders drastically. Within weeks, the careful prosperity Hazel and Cade had built began to erode. "We're going to be all right," Cade said firmly when Hazel presented him with the increasingly desperate numbers. "We have savings. We have stock. We'll tighten our belts and weather this like we've weathered everything else." "But the baby's coming in 3 months. We need money for Doc Winters, for supplies, for—" "We'll have it." His certainty was absolute. "Trust me, Hazel. We've built something strong enough to survive this." She wanted to believe him, but the numbers told a different story. By August, they'd had to dip into the future jar twice to make ends meet. Hazel went back to skipping meals, though Cade noticed immediately and forced her to eat, threatening to sit on her if necessary until she finished every bite. They let Mrs. Kowalski go with regret and generous severance, taking on the full burden of the store themselves. The hours grew longer, the work harder, the margins thinner. And through it all, Hazel's body continued its inexorable transformation. She grew round and ungainly, her back aching constantly, her ankles swelling in the summer heat. She couldn't stand for long periods anymore without getting dizzy, couldn't lift or carry the way she used to. Cade took over more of the physical work, but there were simply tasks only she could do: managing the books, dealing with difficult customers, making the hundreds of small decisions that kept the store running. "I feel useless," she said one evening in late August, frustrated to tears by her own limitations. "You're creating a human being," Cade reminded her gently. "That's the least useless thing anyone could possibly do. Everything else is secondary." "But what if we lose the store? What if all this work, everything we've built, what if it's all for nothing?" He pulled her into his arms, careful of her swollen belly. "Then we'll start over. We've done it before, we can do it again. The store is just a building, Hazel. What matters is us. This family we're making, nothing else." His words helped, but the fear lingered. She'd worked so hard to transform her life, to become someone more than just duty-bound survival. The thought of losing it all, of sliding back into that desperate existence she'd fought so hard to escape, was almost paralyzing. September brought a crisis that tested them like nothing before. A traveling salesman came through town offering to buy their entire stock at 30 cents on the dollar, an insulting lowball, but cash money when they desperately needed it. He gave them 2 days to decide, and for 48 hours, Hazel and Cade barely spoke to each other, both thinking through the terrible arithmetic of survival. "If we sell, we'll have enough to get through winter and the baby's birth," Hazel said finally, staring at the numbers for the 100th time. "We could restock in spring if the economy improves." Start over again. "If we sell, we lose all our leverage with the wholesaler. We lose our reputation as a reliable supplier. We might not recover." Cade rubbed his face tiredly. "But if we don't sell and we can't make it through winter, we could lose everything anyway." They sat in silence, the weight of the decision crushing down on them both. Finally, Hazel stood, awkwardly, her hands bracing her lower back, and moved to the window, looking out at the street where this whole improbable story had begun. The street where Cade had first ridden into town, the window where their eyes had met across impossible distance. "No," she said quietly. "We don't sell." "Hazel, we don't sell," she repeated more firmly, turning to face him. "You told me once that we'd built something strong enough to survive. I'm choosing to believe that. I'm choosing to bet on us, on what we've created together. If we lose, at least we'll lose fighting for something we believe in." Cade studied her face for a long moment, then slowly smiled. "All right then, we fight. Together." They sent the salesman away the next morning with a polite refusal, and Hazel felt simultaneously terrified and liberated by the decision. They were betting everything on their own determination, their own partnership. It was reckless and probably stupid and absolutely necessary. The next weeks were brutal. They cut expenses to the bone, no luxuries, no waste. Every penny accounted for and stretched as far as it would go. Emily helped by working in the store for free during her hours off from teaching. Chester Malloy and the Morrison boys spread word among the ranchers that Turner and Wren was the place to do business, that Cade and Hazel were good people worth supporting. Mrs. Chen organized the Chinese community to shift their purchasing to the store instead of ordering from Blackwater. Slowly, painfully slowly, the tide began to turn. Small orders started coming in. Customers who'd been buying on credit managed to pay their accounts. The bank panic began to ease, and money started flowing again. Not freely, but enough to breathe. By October, they'd stopped hemorrhaging money. By early November, they were breaking even again. And all the while, Hazel's body prepared for the imminent arrival of their child. Doc Winters examined her regularly, pronounced everything progressing normally, warned Cade to prepare for anything because first babies were unpredictable. Emily had everything ready: tiny clothes washed and folded, blankets softened with handling, a cradle that Chester Malloy had built and placed in the bedroom Hazel and Cade shared. The baby came on a cold November night, arriving with the first real snowfall of winter. Hazel's labor began at closing time, progressed rapidly through the evening, and by midnight had Doc Winters calling for hot water and clean towels and reminding Cade that pacing wore out the floorboards. Emily sat with Hazel through the worst of it, holding her hand and talking her through contractions with the calm efficiency of someone who'd seen her mother through multiple births before their parents died. Cade was allowed in the room only between contractions, looking terrified and awed and completely helpless in the face of what his wife was enduring. Hazel found his fear oddly comforting, proof that this was real, that it mattered, that they were in this together even when he couldn't share the physical burden. "I'm right here," he kept saying, kneeling beside the bed during the brief respites between pains. "I'm not going anywhere. You're doing so well, Hazel. You're so strong." "Tell me, again," she gasped as another contraction built. "Tell me again why we thought this was a good idea." "Because we're creating someone who's going to be even more amazing than you," he said, and there was such absolute conviction in his voice that Hazel almost believed him. The baby arrived just after 3 in the morning, sliding into Doc Winters' waiting hands with a lusty cry that announced her displeasure with the cold world she'd just entered. A girl. They had a daughter. "Small but healthy," Doc Winters pronounced, wrapping the baby in blankets before placing her on Hazel's chest. "Good color, good lungs, all fingers and toes accounted for." "You did well, Mrs. Turner." Hazel looked down at the tiny, red, furious creature on her chest and felt something in her heart expand so rapidly it was almost painful. This was her daughter, hers and Cade's. This small person who hadn't existed 9 months ago was now the center of their entire universe. "She's perfect," Cade whispered, kneeling beside the bed with tears streaming openly down his face. "Hazel, she's absolutely perfect." "She's wrinkly and angry," Hazel said, but she was crying too. "And the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." They named her Rebecca, after Hazel's mother, with the middle name Grace because that's what she represented, the grace of new beginnings, of love that transforms, of hope that refuses to die. Rebecca. Grace Turner, weighing in at just over 6 pounds, with a shock of dark hair and her father's amber eyes, and a cry that could wake the dead. The next weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming love. Rebecca proved to be a demanding baby, wanting to eat constantly, to be held constantly, to have the world organized according to her preferences at all times. Hazel, still recovering from childbirth, found herself more exhausted than she'd ever been in her life, more exhausted even than those terrible months after her mother died when she'd been running the store and caring for her father alone. But this exhaustion was different. This exhaustion came with purpose, with joy, with the profound satisfaction of nurturing new life. And more importantly, she wasn't alone. Cade took turns walking the floor with Rebecca at night, changed diapers with increasing competence, learned to soothe her when Hazel was too tired to function. Emily came by daily to help with the store, allowing Hazel to rest and nurse and slowly recover her strength. Mrs. Chen brought meals. Mrs. Fletcher offered advice. Chester Malloy carved a set of wooden blocks for when Rebecca got older. The community that had celebrated their wedding and their store's reopening now rallied around them as new parents, proving once again that Hazel belonged here, was valued here, was seen and known and loved here. Christmas came and went in a haze of baby care and grateful celebration. They'd made it. Against all odds, through economic crisis and personal challenge, they'd made it. The store was still standing, still operating, still theirs. They were poor but not desperate, stretched thin but not breaking. And they had Rebecca, this tiny, demanding miracle who transformed them from a couple into a family. "Look at her," Cade whispered one evening in late December, holding his sleeping daughter against his chest while Hazel sorted stock for the next day. "Look at what we made, Hazel. Isn't she the most magnificent thing you've ever seen?" "She is," Hazel agreed, though privately she thought Cade holding Rebecca was actually the most magnificent thing. This strong man made gentle by love. This former wanderer made permanent by commitment. This partner who'd kept every impossible promise. New Year's arrived with fresh snow and fresh hope. 1885 would be their year, Cade declared with characteristic optimism. The economy was recovering, their customer base was solid, and Rebecca would grow from helpless infant to slightly less helpless baby. They would continue building, continue growing, continue proving that love and determination could overcome almost anything. But January brought one final test, one last challenge before they could truly rest. A letter arrived from Denver, forwarded through multiple addresses before finally reaching Wild Rose Valley. It was from a lawyer representing the estate of Samuel Wren's brother, an uncle Hazel had never known existed, who died without children and left his small mining claim to his only living relative. A mining claim? Hazel stared at the letter in disbelief. Papa never mentioned having a brother. They were estranged, the letter explained. Your uncle left home young and made his way west, eventually staking a claim near Central City. The claim never produced much, but there's a cabin on the property and about 40 acres of mountain land. It's yours now, if you want it, along with your uncle's small savings, approximately $200, enough to cover the legal fees and leave you with a modest inheritance. $200. More money than they'd seen in months. More money than they'd had in the future jar. Jar? At its fullest. Money that could restock the store properly, could give them the cushion they desperately needed, could transform their careful survival back into actual prosperity. We should sell the claim, Hazel said immediately. We don't need mountain property. We need the money here. But Cade was quiet, reading and rereading the letter with an expression Hazel couldn't quite interpret. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes bright with possibility. What if we didn't sell it right away? What if we used it? Used it how? The store is doing well enough now that Emily could manage it for a week or two if we needed her to. What if we took Rebecca up to the property, saw what we've inherited? Maybe it's worthless. Maybe it's a gold mine, literally or figuratively. But shouldn't we at least look before we decide? Hazel opened her mouth to argue. They couldn't possibly take a 3-month-old baby into the mountains, couldn't possibly leave the store, couldn't possibly waste time on what was almost certainly a worthless piece of rock. But something in Cade's expression stopped her. He wasn't suggesting this lightly. He was asking for something more. You want an adventure, she said slowly. One last adventure before we're completely settled. Maybe, he smiled sheepishly. Or maybe I just want to show you the mountains. Want you to see the places I used to roam? Want Rebecca to breathe mountain air before she's old enough to be afraid of it. We've spent so long just surviving, Hazel. Maybe it's time we let ourselves actually live a little. She thought about the girl she'd been a year and a half ago, the one who'd never left Wild Rose Valley, who'd thought her life would be forever circumscribed by these few streets and this small store. She thought about what Cade had given her, not just love or security, but possibility. The understanding that life could be more than duty, could include joy and adventure, and the courage to say yes to unexpected opportunities. All right, she said, let's go see our inheritance. They made the journey in late February, when the store was traditionally slowest, and Emily could handle things without too much stress. The trip took 4 days by wagon, winding through foothills and then climbing into proper mountains, the air growing thinner and colder and somehow cleaner. Rebecca rode in a basket padded with blankets, alternately sleeping and protesting, while Hazel and Cade took turns driving and navigating the increasingly difficult terrain. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was smaller than Hazel expected, but solidly built, nestled in a small valley with a creek running through it and mountains rising on all sides. Snow lay thick on the ground, but smoke came from the chimney, a Apparently the lawyer had arranged for someone to air the place out and get it habitable before their arrival. "What do you think?" Kate asked, helping Hazel down from the wagon while she held Rebecca close against the cold. Hazel looked around at the pristine snow, the towering pines, the absolute silence broken only by the creek's gurgle and the occasional bird call. It was beautiful, intimidating, completely impractical, and somehow absolutely perfect. "I think my uncle had good taste in isolation," she said finally. They spent a week at the cabin, exploring the property, examining the played-out mine shaft, taking stock of what they'd inherited. The land itself was worthless for mining, but potentially valuable for timber or grazing. The cabin was small but well-constructed, capable of housing a family if they were willing to live simply. And the setting, the raw beauty of it, the sense of space and possibility, was priceless. On their last evening, they sat on the cabin's porch watching the sun set over the mountains, turning the snow pink and gold. Rebecca slept in Hazel's arms, bundled against the cold. Cade's arm was around them both, solid and warm. "We could keep it," Cade said quietly. "Use it as a summer place. Bring the children here when they're old enough to appreciate it. Build something up here, slowly, over years." "Children plural?" Hazel raised an eyebrow. "You're planning more already?" "If you're willing, if we're blessed that way." He kissed her temple. "I want a house full, Hazel. I want noise and chaos and love overflowing. I want Rebecca to have siblings, to never be alone the way we both were." "That sounds exhausting." "It does," he agreed cheerfully, "but also wonderful, don't you think?" Hazel looked down at Rebecca's sleeping face, at this miracle they'd created together, and imagined more. A house full of children, all of them knowing they were wanted, loved, valued, all of them growing up secure in the knowledge that they mattered, that they were beautiful, not for how they looked, but for who they were. "Yes," she said softly. "I think it sounds wonderful." They returned to Wild Rose Valley with Rebecca, the inheritance money, and a plan. They'd keep the mountain property, visit it occasionally, maybe build it into something more substantial over time. But their real life was here, in this town that had become home, running the store that bore both their names, raising their family in the community that had supported them through everything. Spring came again, bringing with it renewed prosperity as the economy fully recovered. Turner and Wren General Goods thrived, expanding their customer base and their reputation. Emily's school grew, and she began courting a young teacher who'd come west from Boston. Chester Malloy retired from carpentry but still came around daily to hold Rebecca and dispense unsolicited advice. Mrs. Chen's grandchildren grew, and she started teaching Hazel how to cook proper Chinese food, something Cade appreciated enormously. By Rebecca's first birthday, Hazel was pregnant again, a pregnancy she recognized earlier this time, that she faced with more confidence and less terror. This baby would be born in autumn, and they'd already started planning the expansion of their living quarters to accommodate a growing family. "2 children by the time we've been married 3 years, Hazel said one evening, watching Cade play with Rebecca on the floor of their bedroom. "Mama would have been so happy." "She would have been proud," Cade corrected. "Proud of everything you've become, everything you've built." He looked up at her, his face serious. "Do you ever think about it? About where you were when we met versus where you are now?" "All the time." Hazel joined them on the floor, awkward with pregnancy but determined. "Sometimes I can barely remember that girl, the one who thought she was plain and unremarkable and destined for nothing but duty." "She wasn't plain," Cade said firmly, as he'd said 100 times before. "She was just waiting for someone to really see her. Maybe. Or maybe I was waiting to see myself." Hazel took his hand, pressed it to her growing belly where their second child kicked and turned. "You didn't just love me, Cade. You taught me how to love myself. How to believe I was worth loving. That's the real gift you gave me." He pulled her close as her belly would allow, and kissed her thoroughly, while Rebecca giggled and tried to climb on both of them. This was their life now, messy and chaotic and absolutely nothing like the lonely existence Hazel had imagined for herself. But it was real, and it was hers, and it was built on the foundation of a cowboy who'd walked into her store one hot afternoon and refused to see her as anything less than extraordinary. The new sign they'd commissioned for the store's second anniversary said it all. Turner and Wren General Goods, established 1883, family-owned, community-focused, built on love. Kate had wanted to add that last line, and though Hazel had protested it was too sentimental, too revealing, she'd ultimately agreed because it was true. Everything they'd built, the store, the family, the life, was built on love. The kind of love that saw past surfaces to truth, that kept promises even when it was hard, that chose partnership over perfection every single day. On a warm June morning, 2 years after their wedding, Hazel stood in the store with their son, Daniel Samuel Turner, named for Cade's father and hers, sleeping in a sling against her chest, while Rebecca toddled around touching everything within reach. Cade was making a delivery to one of the ranches. Emily was teaching. The store was busy but manageable. Everything was ordinary. Everything was perfect. Margaret Sullivan, now Margaret Preston after her society wedding, came in with her own small daughter, visiting Wild Rose Valley for the summer and wanting to see how things had changed. She stopped short when she saw Hazel, her eyes widening. "Hazel Wren. Turner, I mean. I hardly recognized you." "That seems to be a theme, like," Hazel said with genuine amusement. "How are you, Margaret? How's married life treating you?" "Well enough. Matthew's business is thriving. Denver is exciting." But Margaret's voice lacked conviction. She looked around the store, at the thriving business and the sleeping baby and the happy toddler. "You look happy. Really, truly happy. Happier than I've ever seen you." "I am." Hazel didn't hesitate. "More than I ever imagined possible." "I thought you'd have sold this place by now. Moved somewhere less provincial. But you've stayed. You've built something." "We've built a life," Hazel corrected gently. "The store is just part of it. The family is part of it. The community is part of it. All of it together. That's what matters." Margaret looked at her for a long moment, and something like envy flickered in her eyes. "I think I was wrong about you, Hazel. About what you were capable of. About what made someone beautiful. You're—" She paused, searching for words. "You're radiant. That's the only word for it. You're absolutely radiant." After Margaret left, Hazel caught her reflection in the store window. The same window where she used to avoid her own gaze, where she'd seen only plainness and inadequacy. But the woman looking back at her now was different. Not because her features had changed, but because everything behind them had. She stood straighter, smiled more readily, moved through the world with confidence born of being loved and learning to love herself. She was beautiful. Not in spite of her angular features or work-worn hands or the exhaustion of caring for 2 small children, but because of everything she'd become. Because beauty, she finally understood, was never about perfection. It was about courage and resilience and love and the willingness to keep showing up, keep trying, keep believing that tomorrow might be better than today. Cade came back from his delivery just before closing time, sweeping in with his characteristic energy and gathering his family into his arms. "How are things here?" "Busy. Good. Margaret Sullivan stopped by." Hazel smiled against his shoulder. "She said I was radiant." "You are." Cade pulled back to look at her, his amber eyes warm with absolute certainty. "You always have been. I just happened to be the first person who told you so." That evening, after the children were asleep and the store was locked, and they had the rare luxury of quiet time together, Hazel and Cade stood at their bedroom window looking out at Wild Rose Valley. The same view that had once seemed like a cage now looked like home, beloved, familiar, full of possibility. "Happy?" Cade asked, his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "More than I can say." Hazel leaned back against him, secure in his embrace. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me. For coming back when you promised. For teaching me that I was worth loving. For building this life with me." She turned in his arms to face him. "For everything." Cade cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle and reverent. "You gave me just as much, Hazel Turner. You gave me a home, a purpose, a reason to stop wandering and start building. You gave me everything that matters." He kissed her then, soft and deep and full of promise, The same promise he'd made that first evening over supper at the boarding house. The promise he'd kept through economic crisis and personal challenge and all the ordinary chaos of building a life together. The promise that they would face whatever came next as partners, as equals, as two people who'd chosen each other and kept choosing each other every single day. Outside, Wild Rose Valley settled into night. Somewhere in town, Emily was probably reading by lamplight in her room at the boarding house. Chester Malloy was likely sitting on his porch, smoking his pipe and remembering. Mrs. Chen was putting her grandchildren to bed with stories in Cantonese. Doc Winters was making his rounds. All the ordinary people living their ordinary lives in this small frontier town that had been Hazel's entire world and then had expanded to include so much more. The store they'd built would stand for decades, eventually passed down to Rebecca and Daniel and the 3 more children who would follow. The mountain property would become a summer retreat, a place where the Turner children learned to love the wild country their father had once roamed. Wild Rose Valley would grow and change, surviving boom and bust, drought and prosperity, watching generations come and go. But all of that was still to come. Right now, in this moment, there was just this. Hazel and Cade in their bedroom above the store they'd saved together, their children sleeping peacefully in the next room, their love as solid and real as the floorboards beneath their feet. "I love you," Hazel whispered into the darkness. "I love our life. I love everything we've built together." "And we're not done building yet," Cade promised. "There's so much more ahead of us. So many more years, so many more memories, so many more reasons to be grateful we found each other." He was right, of course. They had decades ahead of them, decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. The whole messy, beautiful reality of a life fully lived. But they'd face it all together, the way they'd faced everything since that hot afternoon when a trail cowboy had walked into a failing general store and seen not a plain shopkeeper but a remarkable woman worth coming back for. Hazel Wren had spent 20 years believing she was unremarkable, invisible, destined for nothing but survival. But Cade Turner had looked at her and seen everything: the strength, the courage, the capacity for love, the breathtaking beauty of a woman who refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier. And in teaching her to see herself through his eyes, he'd given her the greatest gift of all. Not rescue, not salvation, but the courage to save herself, to believe she was worthy of the love and life and happiness that had always been possible if she'd only been brave enough to reach for them. Standing in their bedroom with the man who'd kept every promise, surrounded by the life they'd built from almost nothing, Hazel finally understood what she'd been too afraid to believe all those months ago when Cade first offered her his mother's pearl ring. She had always been beautiful. She had always been remarkable. She had always been worth loving. She'd just needed someone to hold up a mirror and refuse to look away until she finally saw the truth. And now, looking at her reflection in the window glass with Cade's arms around her, and her children sleeping nearby, and her whole beautiful, impossible life spread out before her like a promise, Hazel Turner smiled at the woman looking back and recognized her at last, not as plain or unremarkable or destined for nothing but survival, but as someone extraordinary who'd simply been waiting for the right moment to bloom. That moment had come, and it was more magnificent than she'd ever dared to dream.